Welcome everybody to CSIS and the Indo-Pacific Forecast 2026, brought to you by the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at CSIS. I'm Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Korea Chair at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown. This is going to be a very engaging, we hope, and fun discussion over the course of this morning. There's a lot of things going on around the world right now that is attracting or distracting our attention. For those of us working on the Indo-Pacific, whether it's Ukraine or the Middle East or Venezuela, or potentially a Supreme Court decision that might drop while we're doing the Indo-Pacific forecast this morning on tariffs. But none of these things are at all disconnected from the Indo-Pacific, where critical U.S. strategic and economic interests are at stake. We will look at many of these connections today, as well as predictions about what's in store for 2026, with 3 sessions on allies and partners, on economic trend lines, and on security. For those of you who are new to attending and participating in the Indo-Pacific forecast, this is an interactive session, meaning you all are going to be participating by answering questions that we pose to you. You will be generating the data from which our experts will be commenting and responding, either violently agreeing or violently disagreeing with what you all think. So it should be a great deal of fun. So with this, let me turn the session over to Nick St. Cheney, who will be moderating the first session on allies and partners. And thank you all again for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome. I'm Nick St. Cheney. I'm the Vice President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department here at CSIS, and also Senior Fellow with the Japan Chair. And it's really my honor to moderate our first panel on allies and partners. Let me introduce our panelists quickly, and then we'll get right to the voting, so to speak. We're joined virtually by Charles Adell, Senior Advisor in Australia, Chair here at CSIS. Welcome, Charlie. Good to see you. And, of course, Dr. Cha, who just introduced himself to you. We also have Christy Gavella, Senior Advisor and Japan Chair. Next to her is Rick Grasso, Senior Advisor and Chair on India and Asia Emerging Economics. And to my immediate left is Greg Poling, who's a Senior Fellow and Director for Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative here at CSIS. As Dr. Cha mentioned, you are going to drive this conversation in many ways. If you scan the QR code on your screen, we're going to ask multiple choice questions one at a time, and you'll get to vote on those, and then we will comment based on the results. It's a little early in the morning here, and colleagues from around the world who might be watching virtually might be a little sleepy, depending on where they are. So we're going to start with a practice question, just a warm-up. And so we'll pull that up on the screen and see how you feel about the weather today. Very consequential issue.
Divisive, too.
Yeah, I would say Washington is better than good. It's pretty warm today, but the cold weather is coming. Excellent. Okay, so I think you're all getting the hang of it. And we will let you vote for a little bit, freeze the screen, and then have a conversation with the panel. So let's get going. We're going to start with political dynamics in the region. And our first question is, which of the following leaders will gain the most domestic power this year? Anthony Albanese, Lee Jae-myung, Takaichi Sanae, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., or Narendra Modi? It's a tough question. People are pondering it seriously.
Second, too. Not everybody might have downloaded it right away. We flash that up every second so we can do a snap of it.
Can we flash the QR code again or no?
Just in case a couple people need that. Grab it.
All right, we will do that again. There we go. If you want to chime in. All right, back to the voting. Wait a couple more seconds. Okay, let's freeze that. Thank you. So coincidentally or not, the Japan chair at CSIS is very well informed. News broke in Japan today that the prime minister might be calling a snap election soon. So not surprising that 63% of you thought Takaichi Sanae might solidify her political footing this year. So let's turn to Christy. Why don't you start us off? Give us your sense of political dynamics in Japan.
Well, big news in Japan today. So it's a gamble. Takaichi is taking a bet. She has sky-high approval ratings. I've seen them as high as 78% lately. And she's betting that the people of Japan like her more than they dislike her party, the LDP, whose support ratings are down around low 30s right now. So, the logic is that she can capitalize on her popularity, she can get a new mandate for all of the things she wants to do, and she can get a little bit of relief from pressure from her new coalition partner. So if it pays off, this could be great, but there's a lot of complication involved. So I think it's probably the best chance she has, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a big risk, but if she pulls that off, we could enter a period of political stability in Japan, which will certainly have implications for geopolitics in the region. Thank you, Christy. Rick, 22% said Narendra Modi. How about that? Why don't you give us a breakdown on what's going on in India?
I'm a little surprised it was that high. I might disagree, but there is kind of a moment when this could become a successful prophecy, I guess. Prime Minister Modi, of course, is in the second year of his third term, and suffered a pretty significant setback a year and a half ago when his party, they did win a re-election, but they lost a single-party majority that they had 2 times in a row. But he hasn't been hurt domestically necessarily by the wobbliness in U.S.-India relations. He's been relatively protected from that. The country's had decent economic growth rate, expected to be about 7%, which is one of the largest of large economies. Greg pointed out, not quite the biggest, but they're doing pretty well in terms of growth. We saw an extremely successful session of Parliament that just wrapped up. 2 of the big issues that I've been working on most of my adult life on U.S.-India nuclear cooperation, they finally resolved this liability issue that basically stymied U.S. Civilian nuclear cooperation, and they passed a critical insurance bill to open up foreign investment a little bit further. But the one inflection point that I see coming up this year, which probably will be a nothing burger, but might have a bump on the upside, are going to be 5 state elections that will be taking place late spring. These 5 elections, 5 states, it's a total population of 300 million people. If you follow our work, you know that state governments really do drive a lot of what happens with the development trajectory. And only one of the 5 states is the BJP, Modi's party, been a significant player. But there's another state in the east, West Bengal, 85 million people. If they have a good showing there, if they manage to win the election or have a good showing, that could strengthen Prime Minister Modi's hand pretty significantly, directly between being, controlling a state, but also indirectly, because when you win state elections, India's upper house of parliament is indirectly elected by state governments. So the more states you win, the more chance Prime Minister Modi has on stacking the deck in the upper house of parliament. So the likelihood of them having a big sweep in the state elections is pretty low. It's not states generally, they've been competitive, but if they surprise us on the upside, then this could come true.
Excellent, thank you. I neglected to mention at the outset that we'll reserve some time at the end of the panel for audience questions, so feel free to hold those in reserve in addition to stimulating our conversation up here. President Lee came in at 10%. So Victor, welcome your perspective on Korean politics.
So I'm actually surprised that it's that low. That could just mean there are more people here who follow the Japan chair than are here who follow the Korea chair. Objectively speaking, because, so he won the special election after the impeachment crisis in Korea, managed to negotiate a major agreement with the Trump administration, the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, $350 billion of investment in the United States, including in new areas like shipbuilding, and of course the big news was potential nuclear propulsion submarines that will be a product of U.S. and South Korean efforts. He holds a majority in the parliament. the National Assembly. It's a unicameral National Assembly, but he holds a majority there. His party holds a majority there. So he looks pretty primed for having a lot of things going in his direction. But I guess the reason the number is lower is because, as Rick said, with India and Korea, there are elections as well. These are not the legislative elections, the national elections. They are the local elections in June of this year. And those elections, even though they are for more minor posts, but not entirely minor, mayors and governors of cities and provinces, they will still be largely interpreted as a referendum on his first year and a half or so in office. So, and of course, Korean politics is almost as polarized as it is here in the United States. And so it'll be a pretty bitter struggle. And, there may be a chance that the opposition party does better, which might stymie him a little bit. So in the end, when I think about it, 10%, that's probably fair. I'll agree with you all that 10% is about fair. So.
Very generous of you. Thank you. Charlie, over to you. Albanese got 4%, but why don't you share your perspective on what's going on in Australia?
Yeah, I think the audience got it about right relative to the other countries, because there's something of a contradiction that Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, enters this year in a strong and weakened position at the same time. So let me start off with the strengths. There aren't elections coming up in Australia. They had elections this past May. The result was a surprise outcome where the Labour government that Anthony Albanese helms has an overwhelming majority, and they're going to probably stay in power through mid-2028. If you look at the dynamics, what's happening within the political parties, the opposition, that's a coalition between the Liberals and the Nationals, has really struggled to find their footing, both politically and substantively, and their numbers have shrunk at the federal level. Moreover, that coalition has had friction come between it on short-term issues that are giving way to kind of long-term challenges about whether or not they can stay together. On top of that, One Nation, which is a far-right party, has picked up significant head of steam in Australia, which is eating away at the traditional voter base for Liberals. And if you kind of factor in 1 + 2 + 3, the overall impact of that dynamic is that Labour, which Albanese runs the Labour government, is in a structurally dominant position. However, and there's a big however here, after the horrific attacks on the Australian Jewish community at Bondi Beach on December 14th, this picture is changing. Many, maybe even most of Australians felt that the government was slow off the mark in its response, unresponsive to community pressure, and generally out of tune with larger public sentiment. Now, the government has started moving, but if Albanese and Labour were a juggernaut, politically speaking, last year, this last month has seen really significant declines in public confidence about Albanese, about the Labour Party, and about the general direction of the country. So the question that we got about whether or not they're going to gain, Albanese will gain power, will really be based off of how the government responds to the shootings and really to rampant rise in anti-Semitism in the country, what inflation does to the politics of the country, and what the opposition ends up doing this year.
Excellent. Thanks, Charlie, for that detailed laydown. Finally, Greg, we only have 5 options, so we threw Marcos of the Philippines in there. But if you want to give us a tour of Southeast Asia from a political standpoint, feel free to do that too. Thank you.
Yeah, I was not asked which Southeast Asian leader would go up there. I think 2% is fine for Marcos. President Marcos is in a difficult spot at the moment because the government's still caught up in this historic corruption scandal resulting from misuse of public funds for flood control projects that were unveiled after horrendous flooding last year. Investigations are ongoing. There's a lot of concerns that they're going to go after low-level officials and operators, but that members of the Senate and House who are actually the ones engaging in this graft are going to skate by. The most recent poll says that about 55% of Filipinos still have faith that the government will go after the big fish, but that's down from 75% a few months ago. So there is this window of opportunity for the government to show that they're serious. It's unlikely to strengthen his hand, though. This is a lot of downside, not a lot of upside. The other thing I'd flag for the Philippines is that this year we will likely finally get the start of the official trial for former President Duterte in The Hague, which most of last year was spent arguing about his mental health and his fitness for trial. This year it seems that that's going to go forward, which will have huge implications for Marcos and the Philippines heading into the 2028 elections. The most interesting politics in South Asia right now are the three places where we're actually getting elections or significant formation of government. So that would be Thailand, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Thailand will hold its election next month. I don't know who's going to win. It will either be a majority by the Progressive People's Party or a coalition government of the current ruling Phumjai Thai. So I'm not going to make any predictions about who comes out on top there. Nobody in Thailand knows. I certainly don't. Myanmar had the second round of its sham elections on Sunday. The third round will be at the end of the month. Nothing will change other than some of the generals will put on ties. And countries like India and China and maybe the US will choose to recognize that government in pursuit of critical minerals and scam centers. More interesting is Vietnam. Next week, the regular 5-yearly National Congress kicks off. What seems all but certain is that General Secretary To Lam, who's been acting in an acting capacity since his predecessor, Wen Fu-chum, died, will be not only reconfirmed, given a full 5-year term as General Secretary, but is also likely to be dual-hatted as president on a permanent basis, which would be a historic shift in Vietnam, more along the China model. It will degrade the role of the prime minister, and it'll make the general secretary clearly preeminent in a system that up till now has always been dominated by what are called the four pillars, relatively co-equal leadership between the party general secretary, the president, prime minister, and head of the National Assembly. There will now be one premier leader in Vietnam, and any successor is likely to continue that.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I really appreciate you all sort of providing an overview of political dynamics, which is really critical to understanding international relations in the region. And so let's transition to our second question. So audience members, we want your view on the following. In 2026, U.S. security cooperation will advance the most with Philippines, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and India. We really planted a lot of people in the audience, Christy.
That was fast. That felt like a...
No votes for India. Come on, people.
Should hire one of those horse race announcers here. And in the lead, Japan, South Korea coming up behind.
All right, a couple more seconds. See if it evens out. All right, thank you.
We got it. Come on, freeze it.
Let's freeze it, Minji. We got India on the board. That's what matters. But let's start with
Thank you,
that.
staff member of mine that voted. Thank you.
Yeah, your staff and interns. Rick, let's start with you, though. 2%. I mean, are the expectations for U.S.-India security cooperation that low? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about advancements. You know, I think the plateau that we've reached is certainly better than it was 10, 20 years ago. We've got increased U.S. exports to India. We've got some real attempts at trying to co-develop new military technologies. We've become India's largest exercise partner. They're a significant exercise partner of the United States. And even operationally, you know, some indications that have been put out there in terms of U.S. support for India when China invaded the border a few years ago. And India joining Combined Maritime Force Bahrain, India allowing some shipyards to be licensed and authorized to do repair and resupply on U.S. Navy vessels. Those are some big deal movements that have happened in recent years. And I think right now, when we're still trying to figure out, are we going to get a trade agreement? Is President Trump more interested in building a relationship with Pakistan, which would push India apart? There's a lot of questions on the table right now, which I don't think that we're likely to see dramatic setbacks on military cooperation with India, but the question is kind of posed, which one will advance the most? And considering, the big jumps that we've taken in recent years in the baseline, yeah, it's hard to imagine at this point where we sit in January to imagine another big step change like we've seen in recent years, where you've got military interoperability on operations and things like that. So not shocked at all by this. We did sign a new 10-year defense framework agreement, but it mostly kind of recast things that were in there in the past. They haven't released the full document, but the couple of fact sheets that have been released kind of indicate. So status quo seems pretty good. I don't imagine dramatic setbacks, but I agree with the answer. Unlikely to see dramatic advances based on where we are in January.
Excellent, thank you. Charlie, Australia came in at 6%. That's a bit of a surprise to me. I think of U.S.-Australia ties as exceptionally strong, critical treaty ally of the U.S., but would welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, I thought it was a little low as well, Nick, but I'll also say that if I were to vote, I might put my vote with either Japan or the Philippines for the most dramatic increases that we're likely to see this year. But I think it's undercut for the fact that, as you already mentioned, cooperation is very good with Australia, and it's proceeding apace. Now, clearly, there are milestones that are laid out with now that we are behind the AUKUS review from the Department of Defense is behind us. But there are some milestones that need to be hit this year for AUKUS to go forward. That's basically the build out of the infrastructure in Perth, Australia, to make sure that those rotational submarines can begin getting out there as early as next year. But AUKUS is not the sum total of the relationship, and we're already seeing marked progress on a range of different fronts. Everything from increased force posture initiatives, that means you're going to see increasing bomber, fighter aircraft, ISR aircraft coming through Australia. There is now going to be pre-positioning of Marine Osprey aircraft at the top end in northern Australia. We've also seen advances in the somewhat awkwardly named acronym GWEO, the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance measure undertaken by the Australians to kind of move forward, creating their own munitions that can also backfill and have supplies for the United States. Now, all those things I think are kind of steady state with a bit of an increase on them. So I think we're in pretty good shape here. The limiting reagents, though, will be, number one, Australian defense expenditures. They have remained steady over the last 4 years at right about 2% of their GDP. There's a lot of critique inside of Australia that this is not enough to pay for both AUKUS and their other defense needs. And of course, the other limiting reagent, if we're talking about cooperation, being American attention and its ability to kind of push forward these various initiatives.
Excellent, thank you. You flagged AUKUS among other things, and I will give you a little preview. The next question is about networking and unilateral arrangements in the region. So we'll see how that fares, and we'll come back to you. Thank you, Charlie. Philippines and South Korea are tied at 23%. I don't know what to do about this. Maybe we should flip a coin and determine who goes first. But why don't we go to you, Greg, and then we'll finish with Northeast Asia. So go ahead.
Yeah, this is the right answer. If we're talking about relative terms, I sat here last year, I think, and said, and Charlie and I argued about whether or not it was AUKUS or U.S. Philippines. And that time I was basing it on things like the fact that the U.S. had approved $500 million in foreign military financing for the Philippines as a supplemental at the end of FY24, which meant that the Philippines' FMF had increased by 1,000% over the course of the Biden administration. Well, the NDAA just approved $500 million per year for the next 5 years in FMF, plus another $500 million in lending authority for the Philippines. It also mandated that the Pentagon has to do a report on future strategy in the Philippines, including the progress on the EDCA sites, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites. We have ongoing work at the Aguila shipyard in Subic, including the fact that Hyundai has agreed to come in and reopen shipbuilding there. So I expect that we will get big announcements on U.S. Navy use of Subic. And the South China Sea isn't going away. So if we're talking about where we were, even at the start of 2025, much less where we were a few years ago and where the Philippines is likely to be at the end of 2026, I think it's hard in percentage terms to find another ally that's made so much progress in such a short amount of time, and that's likely to continue.
Excellent. Victor, over to you on U.S.-Korea ties.
So I think, again, relative to the others, what the audience has voted for makes sense on Korea. I think if the question were in 2026, which country will have the most money put behind advancing defense industrial cooperation, then I would say Korea would win out in that respect. And I say that because there are certain things about U.S. security cooperation in 2026 that will continue. So things like the dialogue and the consultations on extended nuclear deterrence, which were started during the previous administration. The Trump administration has signaled those will continue, as well as trilateral security cooperation with Japan. They've signaled those things would continue. But where there are big changes, I would say, are in two respects. The first is on something called OPCON transition, the transition of wartime operational command back to South Korea. This is something that both the Trump administration and the Lee government have committed to do on a timeline that looks like it's more than just conditions-based by setting out a mark of trying to reach the second sort of threshold. There are three thresholds. The second threshold for OPCON transition they hope to meet this year. And so if that were to happen, that would be a major step forward in security cooperation on an issue that has been really an issue within the alliance going back to when I was in government, like, when the dinosaurs were working in the White House. So that would be major. The other is that in terms of defense industrial cooperation, and I mentioned it in my first answer, the huge amounts of money that are being put behind things like shipbuilding, potentially nuclear propulsion submarines. The scale of the money that we're talking about is really hard to fathom. In the first Trump administration, the U.S.-Korea alliance got wrapped around the axle about one particular issue, which was how much South Korea should pay in terms of host nation support or the special measures agreement. The argument was the little over $1 billion that the Koreans were paying, and the Trump administration wanted $5 billion. And they were not able to reach an agreement, and it became the issue that really sort of stymied the alliance. That was all they would talk about, and it never got resolved. And the Biden administration came in and resolved it. In the most recent agreement, the South Koreans are talking about putting $33 billion towards, not specifically towards host nation support, the language is more ambiguous, but towards the stationing of U.S. forces in Korea. So that just gives you a sign of the scale of what we're talking about. In addition to that, a lot of these activities are taking place under the context of the overall modernization of the alliance, which means both increasing capabilities, increasing and potentially changing force posture on the Korean Peninsula. So one of the things that we could see in 2026, which I think both sides would say is an advancement of security cooperation, is we could see a change in the force posture on the peninsula, whether that means reducing the ground troop presence, increasing air and naval capabilities, things that might have been seen as taboo in previous administrations. I think with the joint fact sheet, they've sort of set the groundwork for potentially changing that force posture in a way that would be, the narrative of which would be positive, advancing security cooperation and overall modernization of the alliance.
Interesting. Some parallels there with what's going on between the U.S. and Japan. So last but not least, Christy, 46%. Give us a little preview of what you expect this year in U.S.-Japan alliance cooperation.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly glad to see so many people feeling confident about the U.S.-Japan relationship and about Japanese politics in general. I think there are good reasons to believe that Japan has a strong potential to increase its security cooperation with the U.S. If we look at all of the changes over the last year, we've seen remarkable continuity in statements from the two governments, reaffirming the support for the alliance. Despite some questions, they're still committed to upgrading U.S. forces Japan and modernizing their command and control architecture. I think we'll probably see a lot of the momentum in the coming year, assuming that Prime Minister Takaichi manages to maintain or perhaps strengthen her position. I think we'll see it come from the Japanese side because, she is very passionate about defense policy. She's already committed to accelerating Japan's planned increase in defense spending to 2% of GDP to next year. If she holds on to her position, she has a coalition partner that is also amenable to security changes. They're planning to revise the 3 strategic documents that define Japanese security policy, potentially loosen their remaining restrictions on arms exports. So that creates a lot of room and momentum for U.S.-Japan cooperation. Of course, there are questions about burden sharing that will have to be answered moving forward. There are concerns that all of the general tumult in not only the U.S.-Japan relationship, but in U.S. foreign policy may be decreasing momentum for cooperation at a time when they need to be moving ahead. But in relative terms, I think U.S.-Japan is positioned well for the coming year.
Great. So we sort of started with the hub and spokes model focused on bilateral relationships, but let's move on to our next question. Blank will generate the most momentum for U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy this year. The Quad, AUKUS, U.S.-Japan, Australia, U.S.-Japan, Korea, or the Squad, which involves the Philippines. Don't be shy. No dramatic movements. We wait a couple more seconds.
We have a pretty clear winner this time.
We sure do. All right, let's freeze it. Thank you. Okay, U.S., Japan, South Korea, trilateral, coming in at 70%. So Christy and Victor, in that order, why don't you share your perspective on that? Are you equally optimistic about trilateralism in Northeast Asia?
I guess I would say to start that it's obvious that the Trump administration has a strong preference for bilateralism in their foreign policy. So all of these, are clearly less central than they were in the last administration. But I think the trilaterals do have good potential moving forward. They have, clear strategic value. I think that we've seen maintenance of some engagement with the U.S., Japan, South Korea mechanisms and dialogues that were started, following the Camp David summit under Yoon Kishida and Biden. So I think, in relative terms, we do see that. Lee and Prime Minister Takaichi had a very successful summit recently. They had some great photo ops and time playing drums together, for example. So I think the leg of the relationship that people have often considered to be the weakest is hanging on and maintaining despite, serious doubts about whether that would be the case last year. So, I think there is good potential. There's always been that strategic motivation for it, but we do see Japan and Korea starting to pick up and push from their end as well in the face of, increasing questions about the U.S. side. So I think all of these would be challenging, but I think either the U.S., Japan, South Korea, or perhaps the U.S., Japan, Australia would have been my top answers.
Excellent. Victor, over to you.
So I would say the audience response makes sense in the context of, these are relative to the other choices, right? And arguably, we haven't seen a lot of activity on the other choices, and maybe that is why they all focused on U.S., Japan, Korea. Because as Christy said, we have seen a number of bilateral summits between, at least 2, and they also, right, 2, 3, well, if you include Gyeongju, right, 3 meetings. And the administration has signaled continuity on U.S., Japan, Korea was actually a specific line, at least in the U.S. Korea joint fact sheet. I don't know if it was in the Japan one, but it was in the Korea one. And so maybe that's why there's a focus on that. I certainly hope that that's right. That I think we'd like to see that continue. In my opinion, when the U.S., Japan, and South Korea trilateral relationship is strong, that addresses a lot of issues in Asia. It addresses a lot of security issues in Asia, in particular whether you're talking about China or North Korea. I think from the Korea side, the question always is, to what extent South Korea will deprioritize the link with Japan or the Trilateral for balancing with China or rebalancing with China or hedging with China. And I think the big surprise that we are all witnessing with regard to the Lee government, which is a progressive government, this is a progressive government in Korea, which traditionally has been in favor of hedging between, or even you can call it de-risking between the United States and China, is what we've seen with the Lee government is that they've been pretty committed to the alliance with the United States and to trilateralism with Japan vis-a-vis the relationship with China. And I would point in particular to the most recent summit meeting that just took place between the South Korean president and the Chinese president. There were, as the press reported, there were 15 MOUs, agreements that came out of the recent South Korea-China summit, and some media wrote about how this was evidence that Korea was rebalancing its diplomacy after going very strong with Japan and the United States, that they were rebalancing with these 15 agreements with China. But if you go and actually look at the 15 agreements with China, I mean, I'm not trying to diss different issue areas, but it's really not that significant or impressive. I mean, so I'm not dissing it, I'm a professor, but it's on things like education, like water, environment. Again, I'm not dissing these issues. And the scale is in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, which on its own might sound impressive, but when you compare it to the scores and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment agreements that are happening between the United States and South Korea on semiconductors, on batteries, on shipbuilding, on nuclear energy, like you can't even compare these two, right? You can't even compare these two. So in that sense, I think what we're seeing in Korea is a progressive government that is not operating according to script and is showing a degree of pragmatism and non-ideological foreign policy that I think surprised many people in Washington. Now, of course, there's still a long way to go. They're still in their first year. As I said, they have elections coming up in June, and then they have national elections following that, and that could change things. But right now, I think this idea of focusing on U.S., Japan, Korea as the one that will generate the most momentum is a good bet for now.
Great. Charlie, back to you. AUKUS got 13%, U.S., Japan, Australia, Trilateral 4%. I was also a little surprised by that, but if you could build on your comments earlier with respect to AUKUS, Japan, Australia ties, the Trilateral, whatever you like. Thank you.
Sure, and I guess this is maybe because I'm the only virtual participant here, I can safely say that the audience totally got this one wrong, certainly in my opinion. I actually think that AUKUS ranks maybe too high relative to the others in terms of what's likely to create real momentum on strategy, on security in the Indo-Pacific, because while the review is now behind us, most of the major muscle movements for AUKUS don't really start to happen until 2027. There will be significant moves then. You will have SURF West, the submarine rotational forces west out of Perth, Australia, stood up, so you will then have rotational deployment. But right now, they're just building out that base. I don't think that necessarily in and of itself generates momentum. Further, when the review came out, at least the part that's been talked about, it was all about Pillar 1, and Pillar 2, the advanced and emerging technologies, is kind of nowhere to be seen. Now, there's been talk for the last 3 years that just wait a little bit more and there will be some marquee projects that are rolled out. And indeed, we heard a couple of investments that the Australians themselves have made, and that might be the case. But I wouldn't hold my breath on AUKUS coming online in a way that will dramatically change the security contours of the region. I also think, though, and this is where I said, my vote was different, where I guess the audience was, that I think the audience underrated significantly both the U.S., Japan, Australia connection and maybe the Squad together. Because not only, I'll start with the U.S., Japan, Australia connection, not only have there actually been positive bilats, but there have actually been some marked successes already in that. If you look at, for instance, the East Micronesia cable, if you talk to leadership, if you talk to people who work in security, they continue to point to this particular one as the sky is the limit. And if you think about the ambitious and training agenda that all three countries have set out for themselves, the now push to really begin to integrate air and missile defense across the region, and some of the agreements that are beginning to roll out about actually putting money to bring online critical minerals together, this strikes me as one that's likely to bear a significant amount of fruit, although I wouldn't underrate, and Greg, I'll be interested to hear what he says about the Squad, because if you kind of take those three and then add in the Philippines, the proximity and nature of the threat, the increasing institutionalization of how the countries and certainly the military leaderships are working together, and really the increasing number of joint maritime drills are giving this configuration, I think, more momentum than we're seeing in some of the other ones.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Greg, feel free to agree, disagree with Charlie, the audience, or both. Over to you.
I agree with Charlie. The difficulty with talking about the Squad is whether or not the Squad exists depends on how hard you squint. I mean, clearly the Trump administration is not going to endorse a four-way organization called the Squad. There is a U.S., Japan, Philippines trilat, as evidenced by the fact that we had a three-way leaders meeting and the first ever Trilateral National Security Advisors meeting in 2024. And we have continued endorsement by the Trump administration of things like the Luzon Economic Corridor, which are explicitly trilateral U.S., Japan, Philippines. We have a U.S., Philippine, Australia trilat that's been mainly focused on military training and capacity building for now almost 2 decades. We do have increasing overlap of those two things because those trilats and the U.S., Japan, Australia trilat are increasingly integrated through things like Philippine participation in exercise Pitch Black in Australia and Japanese increasing participation in Balikatan, which will happen again in the next couple of months as a result of Japan and the Philippines concluding a reciprocal access agreement, effectively a SOFA, as well as an acquisition cross-servicing agreement. Whether or not that is unique, right, is a little less clear now. So you do have a much higher tempo of operations among those four. And you have things like at Osman this year, the Australians were officially invited to take part in parts of the Luzon Economic Corridor, particularly Subic, I think. But you also have the Philippines having concluded now SOFAs with the Canadians, the Kiwis, French and the Brits are expected this year. If we look at the maritime cooperation activities, which is what the Philippines calls these multilateral patrols in disputed waters in the South China Sea, for the first couple of years, it was just about the Squad. But now you've had Canadian participation, New Zealand participation, French participation. You had the French take part in parts of Balikatan last year. So I'm a bit on the fence about, I think that the U.S., Australia, Japan will continue to operate with the Philippines at a higher tempo and more sophistication than other partners. But I'm not sure how much longer we'll be able to look and say there is this like definitive separate group called the Squad. I think there will be a definitive U.S., Japan, Australia, or I'm sorry, U.S., Japan, Philippines trilat, and then there will be increasing Philippine networking with all other like-minded allies and partners. And the Australians may be first at that table, but I'm not sure that there will be like a qualitative difference in perpetuity between what the Philippines does with Australia and what it does with other partners.
Interesting. Thank you. All right, Rick, you've been very patient. Let's take off the S. What's going on with the Quad?
I think it's safe to say the People's Liberation Army is most excited about the results of this part of the quiz. The Quad, how the Quad has fallen. It has the 3 M's that dwarf the other groupings on this: money, muscle, and the map, the location of these places. And to see, the coming together, I think for the last 8 years having a conversation like this, they would be number 1 or number 2 in a grouping like this. As they were growing, as the kind of things that they were working on were expanding. And even though we don't call it a military collaboration, you did see at the end of the Biden administration real strong steps into military interoperability in terms of humanitarian assistance, disaster aid, things like that. And then quiet conversations that, of course, our military leads among the 4 countries were having, even if it wasn't formally part of the Quad agenda. A year ago, I think we thought too, President Trump had really embraced the Quad last time around, elevating it to minister level, which of course President Biden took it up to leaders level. The first foreign policy meeting of the Trump administration, the day after inauguration, was a meeting of the Quad foreign ministers. I think at that time, engaging with White House officials in the Trump administration, they said, they had a desire to pare down a little bit. There was a lot of working groups, a lot of work streams, but not a lot of quantifiable actions that really kind of met the promise. And, that's kind of understandable. Focus energies a little bit more. But right now, we're kind of wondering, what kind of Quad will exist? We're supposed to have a leader summit, which has been delayed multiple times. We still don't know if President Trump is going to go to India this year. Just yesterday or the day before, our ambassador to India, Sergio Gore, who's quite close to the president, said, we hope the president gets to India in the next year or two. I mean, Leader Summit isn't the only thing. You've got working level meetings that are happening on a regular basis, but seeing the president kind of give the stamp of authority is an important thing to provide that wind and momentum that gets all the other agencies to get behind activities underneath the Quad. So I think in many years now, we would have expected this to be number one or number two. The fact that it's the bottom isn't terribly surprising. I think it's safe to say it's on life support, but it is something that I think is definitely worth reviving. And hopefully when we reconvene in a year from now, we'll be very wrong about this, or at least people's aspirations will have increased pretty dramatically.
Great. So expectations for trilateralism, but certainly other frameworks for cooperation in the region that are worth keeping an eye on. Thank you all. We have one more audience question, which we'll get to in a second. But I want to take advantage of this collective expertise on the stage and on the screen to throw in a question to you all, which is basically about how you think our allies and partners in Asia are thinking about responding to the recent U.S. operation in Venezuela. What strategic implications might that have for alliance relationships with the United States or the strategies of individual countries? Early days, but I just wanted to throw that in to get your take. So Charlie, let's start with you. What kind of impact do you think this might have on strategic discourse in Australia?
Yeah, this is great. There's no polls, so we can say whatever we want here. Look, let me note that the opinions kind of coming out of Australia in the wake of Venezuela, and increasingly over talks about whether Greenland too, I'd say a couple things that I'd flag, some of which I'm going to bet are going to be common themes that my colleagues will discuss. General bewilderment, concern over distraction for competing with China, alarm at the flouting of international law, and again, concern, once again, there's an overly narrow focus on the Western Hemisphere. Kind of when you extrapolate outwards from that, there's also concern that we have clearly moved into an era of spheres of influence, and there are questions being raised about what this means for Australia. Whose sphere exactly would they be in, and do they get to choose? Beyond that, though, I'd say that there are maybe two competing camps beyond the general bewilderment. One is a harder edge, more kind of realpolitik camp that has said, it's a minority opinion, that some of what you're seeing, Trump is fundamentally a disruptor, that the U.S. is willing to use its power in ways that it hasn't before, and it's going to disrupt a failing system, a system that's failing for the United States and its allies. Not sure if that's good or not, but this is needed. On the other hand, I think this is probably more vocal in what you hear, is that when you see those disruptions, disruptions are really not good for smaller states. And flouting of international law, particularly if it portends a law of the jungle, disadvantages states that don't have as much power in aggregate for each other. So again, I just return to the point that there's a lot of consternation. People are kind of sorting their way forward. And what this means is for the alliance is being approached very cautiously, although where things might go for Greenland is, I think, kind of really ratcheting up in how people think about this right now.
Excellent. Consternation, disruption, interesting keywords you flagged for us. Let's go quickly down the line here on the stage, starting with Victor.
So I guess I would say the two reactions. The first is for allies like Korea, it just reinforces the unpredictability of the Trump administration. I've always said that, in a sense, President Trump is strategically actually quite predictable, but tactically quite unpredictable. And so, strategically, as we saw in the NSS and in statements he's made, he's clearly talked about the Western Hemisphere, the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but how, in particular, he would execute that was never clear. And so we see these sort of things like Venezuela, which, in a sense, he was signaling, but the extreme nature of the action was quite unpredictable. So, again, I think it reinforces for allies and partners the idea that he is strategically quite transparent, but tactically unpredictable. And so that's something that they all have had to deal with, and that's only been reinforced by that. I think the other way that we can gauge their responses is not what the United States has done, but what the United States actions mean for countries that matter to a place like Korea. So what does it mean for North Korea or for China? I'm not sure. Tom and others in the next panel could sort of talk about what the implications are for China. I'm not really sure. Obviously, there are oil implications for China, and there are implications about norms of behavior, whether China feels like it can then do the same thing with regard to Taiwan. For North Korea, I don't really see a lot of direct implications. There is some, but not a lot of activity between North Korea and Venezuela. I think if the United States were to take actions on Iran, which they have been signaling and talking about, that might have more grave implications for a country like North Korea, which would then obviously impact South Korea. But we're not at that point. Maybe we'll be asking the same question this year, the same question next year about Iran.
So briefly, official responses from the Japanese government have been understandably muted. They've said things like they support restoring democracy in Venezuela as soon as possible, et cetera. But for Japan, what happened has serious and negative implications for the rules-based international order. And that's something which the Japanese government has spent an enormous amount of political capital and time in advocating for and believes in very strongly as important to protecting the stability of the international system. So we've seen Japanese politicians like former Defense Minister Onodera say publicly that essentially this constitutes a change of the status quo by force, and this is something that we criticize China and Russia for on a regular basis. So this is not a positive development at all for Japan, and the consequences for the rules-based international order are at the top of mind when they think about what happened in Venezuela.
India put out a relatively strong statement of concern, but I don't think it's going to have a meaningful impact when you consider everything else on the table. I agree with what Victor had said. I think for India, if this is a further proof point that almost the entire serious focus of foreign policy is going to be on the Western Hemisphere from the Trump administration this time around, that's a concern. This specific action for India, it's another data point proving why we're a strange partner. They think that we do this on almost a weekly basis, even if that's not exactly true. But, we've always had disagreement on most global issues, with the exception of our shared concerns about some of the dangerous elements of the rise of China. So if we come back to India with significant areas of cooperation, military, economic, that allow India to empower itself versus the main threat they face in their own neighborhood, we'll be fine. But absent that, this could be a big deal.
Yeah, the official reactions from Southeast Asia have ranged from strong concern in the Philippines and Singapore to outright condemnation, particularly in Malaysia and to a lesser degree Indonesia. That's to be expected. Those allies and partners who need to maintain the closest security relationship are going to be the ones who are most circumspect. If you look at what, say, opposition or even kind of regime-aligned congresspeople in, say, the Philippines say, though, I think it captures the broad concern, as Christy said, that this is yet another blow to a rules-based order that is extraordinarily important to small post-colonial states in Southeast Asia facing China. There's no net benefit to this for any of them. But I think the idea that the Trump administration is kind of uniquely hostile to that rules-based order is already pretty well internalized across the region at this point. So I think it'll shave another 5 or 10 points off the U.S.'s trust and favorability in the regime, or in the region, but that was already in relative free fall.
Well, thank you all. We're nearing the end of this conversation, but we have 2 excellent panels to follow, one on economic issues and the other will continue the conversation about regional security dynamics. So we hope you stick with us. Victor noted the unpredictability of U.S. foreign policy, and that's really the theme of our final question, which we'll pull up on the screen. Which of the following is most likely to hedge against perceived U.S. retrenchment in the region? India, South Korea, Philippines, Japan, Australia. Wait a little bit longer. Another clear winner. Okay, let's freeze that. Rick, India, a strong hedger. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's both right and wrong. It's right in the sense that I think visibly, and this was the last piece that I put out from CSIS, you've got a lot of engagements with what we consider adversaries. Prime Minister Modi on stage with Putin, with Xi, but the net result of a lot of those engagements is relatively modest. When you consider some of India's other recent engagements with European countries, with New Zealand, with Australia, where you've got far more significant commitments, Japan and others, trade agreements, possibly a trade agreement this year with the European Union. So you do see India reaching out to a lot of other partners, and those partners very excited also to be able to tap the Indian market and to be able to sign trade agreements and such. But in terms of security cooperation, none of those countries brings to the table what the United States can. So they are reaching out. You do see a lot of approaches, mostly the deep partnerships with U.S. friends and allies, but none of them can plug the security hole the way the United States can. So I agree with this in one sense, but on the security side, it's not going to fill the bucket to the extent of what we're leaving on the table.
Great. Victor, South Korea, 21%. What do you think explains?
So I'm going to vehemently disagree with the audience on this one. The only caveat would be if they define hedging as drawing closer to Japan, right? Because I really don't, I do not think that Korea has a choice. South Korea has a choice right now. Given the external environment, given the situation with China and China's activities, it's not just China's activities in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait, it's Chinese activities in the Provisional Maritime Zone, the PMZ, with South Korea, where they are basically encroaching into South Korean maritime territory and jointly managed territories unilaterally. They're basically implementing a similar strategy of dual-use structures like they did in the South China Sea. So, there's that. Of course, there's the North Korea situation, which is only getting worse. They really don't have a choice. And as I mentioned earlier, and we see a progressive government in South Korea that has clearly made the decision to make its bed with the United States. I mean, the South Korean president was here in this room in August of 2025, where he said that South Korea used to pursue a strategy of hedging with economic relations with China and security relations with the United States. He said that model is no longer possible anymore. So in that sense, I don't think they have a choice to hedge. When Trump put the reciprocal tariffs on Liberation Day, every country had to decide how they were going to respond. Canada, Mexico, the EU responded very negatively initially. They all caved in the end, but they all responded very negative initially. They said they wouldn't bend the knee. But Korea and Japan quickly made the decision to say, okay, let's make a deal. Like, what's the deal that we're going to make? They made the decision that they don't have a choice. Like in alliance theory, when you have concerns about an unpredictable ally, you have fears of abandonment. One way you can deal with that is hedging. The other way you can deal with that is drawing closer, right? And that's the choice that both Korea and Japan have made. So I agree. I would actually say 7% on Japan is also too high. And I definitely disagree with the 20 whatever percent it is. I can't read it.
21.
21% for Korea.
Christy, does Japan have a choice?
If you define hedging as drawing closer to China, then that's not an option for Japan right now. So, I mean, under the Ishiba administration, you saw some slight warming. Now all of that has gone away with the tensions over Prime Minister Takaichi's comments on Taiwan. Things are in a very bad state between Japan and China, and that's anticipated to continue. What you see instead, as Victor mentioned, is Japan trying to maintain good relations with the U.S. and trying to very consciously strengthen its relationships with like-minded countries, whether they're in Australia, the Philippines. Also, we had a good meeting with India, cooperation deal with Vietnam, partners in Europe. So Japan is actively going out and building relationships with those countries to try to stabilize its environment, but not turning to China.
Let's go to Greg and Charlie, and Rick, I know you have an additional comment. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a similar situation. I mean, there's no constituency in the Philippines that would accept a closer relationship with China. There was a poll late last year that found that 92, I think, % of Filipinos supported the Marcos administration's policy in the South China Sea. I mean, there's a remarkable amount of consistency in both elite and public views of China now as, an unplacatable adversary. And that has been a shift that's underway since the Duterte administration. So I do think you are seeing more Philippine effort to diversify its security relationships with other partners. This will accelerate thanks to the Trump administration. And even more so, as we're seeing across South Asia, to diversify economic relationships. Marcos is in the UAE this week to sign an FTA with the Emirates and has bid for TPP membership finally, right? So there's an effort to minimize overexposure to the U.S. economically, but that's not hedging. Pulling closer to what our other U.S. allies and like-mindeds isn't hedging.
Charlie, take us home. Is it similar for Australia, keeping the U.S. close while diversifying partnerships in the region? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the menu is a little bit broader than that, but basically I think this is about right, but I think we probably have to put the number at higher than 0%. If you actually look at the polling in Australia, it's been really dramatic over this past year that Lowy polling this past year found that only 36%, I think, of Australians trust the U.S. to act responsibly, which is a 20-point drop in a single year. What that translates to, at least in the commentariat and the chattering classes, is lots of calls for Australia to seriously begin thinking about a plan B. But I think, similar to what a lot of people have said, it's really unclear what a plan B looks like and how different plan B actually is from plan A. It means more outreach to like-mindeds, which Australia is already doing. It means grabbing the U.S. closer, which Australia is clearly doing. It means doing more for themselves, which Australia is debatably doing. And it means less confrontational language in public about China, which Australia is clearly doing already. So I don't see hedging. There's not a lot of choices on the security space. But, the polling numbers are certainly down. The concerns are up. And so the thinking is, what else is there for them to do? And the biggest outstanding question, Victor, I know, talked a lot about how much the Koreans are putting in resource-wise, is if Australia actually wants to have a more independent foreign policy, do they have the resources to do that? And at this point, the answer is no.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, you've all been fantastic. Audience, you've been fantastic. I failed miserably because we're over time and we'll have to conclude. But I hope you'll not hesitate to contact any of our experts if you have follow-up questions. We're going to redo the stage quickly and get right to our economic panel. But before that, please join me in thanking my colleagues for their comments.
Okay, if I can ask you to take your seats, please. We're about to get started again. Okay. All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Will Todman. I'm Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department. And a little plug, I'm also host of a podcast called State of Play. So yesterday we did our first ever live recording of State of Play and did an episode about how China, Russia, and Iran are responding to the capture of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. So please do check that out. And tomorrow, actually, we have another episode coming out, which is predictions for 2026, including all of our program directors from across the department. So we have 12 experts on different parts of the world saying their boldest predictions. So kind of in line with what we're doing today. But this panel is now firmly focused on economics. And I have a wonderful panel of colleagues, largely from our Economic, Security and Technology department. So I'm very excited to collaborate with you. Starting with Naveen Gershankar, to my left, who is the president of the Economic, Security and Technology department, and also the host of the podcast Betting on America. Then Phil Luck is director of our economics program and also the Scholl Chair in International Business. Adam Farah is a non-resident senior associate in the Korea chair and also senior geoeconomics analyst for Asia Pacific with Bloomberg Economics. And Ilaria Mazzocco is deputy director and senior fellow in the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics. So I want to say from the outset, please do make sure you have your phones out. Don't normally say that in a panel, but we want you to be on your phones and to be engaging. There is a QR code on the screen, so please make sure you're ready to go. We also have some QR codes at the back, and then I think at the top you can see if you miss it, then you can go to menti.com and use the code that you can see there. So we really do want you to be involved in this. This is a really fun one, so I'm excited to see what you all think. The other thing I should say is it is possible that in the next few minutes we will get a decision from the Supreme Court about the legality of the IEEPA tariffs. This is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So I hope you'll excuse me, I will be on my phone at some point to see whether or not this news has come down, and you will get an immediate reaction from our panelists. So we will save the tariffs question until the end to give us a little bit longer to hear if that news has come out or not. But let's dive right into our first question. And the first question is about which countries in the Indo-Pacific might exceed growth expectations in 2026. And for the sake of fairness, I'm going to tell you what the IMF thinks. So the IMF forecasts Malaysia 4.3%, India 6.6%, South Korea 1.8%, China 4.5%, and Japan 0.6%. So which of these countries do you think are most likely to exceed growth expectations? Ooh, this is quite even. Okay, I'm going to hold it open for just a couple more seconds, but I think it looks like maybe we have stabilized here. All right, I'll ask you to close it now. Okay, so what do we have? We have India at 32%, right behind Malaysia at 31%, Japan at 15% of the audience, 12% think South Korea, and 10% think China. So Phil, can I turn to you? Do we have geniuses in the audience? Do you think they're right?
Oh, yeah, well, I'd be stupid to say no. No, I mean, honestly, I think this is a good answer in the sort of like good Lord, I have no idea, right, at some level. So I would have expected something along those lines. I think, so I'll put it this way. I'm going to give you your classic economist answer, which is on the one hand, on the other hand. I would say, look, I think the projections are broadly correct and so on average. And I think, unfortunately, many of the sort of known unknowns are not really in the control of these countries, right? I think a huge part of the challenge for all these countries is however trade policy evolves, over the next year. To your point, maybe over the next hour or so, right? Yeah. So a lot of tariffs could come down, within 30 minutes, and a lot of rebates, billions of dollars of money could go back, right? So countries are, hugely exposed to that. India is facing 50% tariffs. Those could be ruled illegal, today. Many of the tariffs facing the rest of these countries as well. I think the ones where there's less uncertainty, I think, are the ones that are lower down there, which is South Korea, Japan, and China. South Korea and Japan, I think there's more consistency in what our foreign policy or our economic policy towards them is going to be, just because the exports sectors there are much more of those strategic sectors where I think we're going to continue to see trade policy sort of be more consistent. Because of the policy direction, but also because the levers they're using are more clearly legally justified. Malaysia, I think, is a really interesting one because there's a lot of potential upside. They've done over a long period now, done a very good job of sort of balancing China and the United States, showing themselves to be a country that's developing very quickly, and being open to a lot of investment, right? So as long as that continues, I think there's a lot of upside there as well. With China, I think I don't think they'll probably exceed it. They could, but I think the key caveat there is not all growth and not all GDP is created equal, and if they exceed their growth expectations, that's going to be a function of sort of direct top-down policy, and I wouldn't consider that to be especially efficient growth, right? The same way that the Russian economies have been growing for the last few years. That's top-down building of things that are not in the long term very effective.
So quite a lot of your answer, you were talking about US policy there. So do you think, is the US really the most important actor here that could shape changes in growth expectations?
I think to me, it's the biggest uncertainty, right? I mean, I think, of course, and that's the thing that's hard to sort of bake into a sort of a growth expectation. There's an enormous amount that affects the growth of these countries. That's everything from demographics to their policy space. Demographics, we can basically see the future there. No, nothing's going to change that for the most part. Policy is very slow moving. I think, India has an opportunity to really make some progress, but again, I think that'll be slow moving. But I think the biggest thing that sort of, if the question is like, where will the expectations be wrong? I think the biggest source of that incorrect assumption is going to be U.S. policy.
Okay. Adam, do you want to jump in here? What do you think the audience got right and wrong, and what are you watching out for?
So obviously,
Yeah.
I agree with the comment so far. I mean, I think the United States and tariff policy will ring large in all of these circumstances, but particularly in the case of India and China. And we're going to get into a broader discussion of where the US-China relationship is going in economics later. But clearly, if the current détente and stability between the United States and China falls apart, it puts massive risk to the global economy, but particularly the Chinese economy, depending on what actions the Trump administration is willing to take. And on the India side, again, many of these, having worked with many of the economists that are looking at these estimates for 2026, there's an assumption that a trade deal with the United States comes through in the first quarter. And, although I think many of us still remain optimistic, that is an open question. And if that doesn't happen, there's likely to be increased pressure on the Indian economy and the Indian currency. So I think, that's really the pivot point for many of these economies. All that said, I do want to change to a different topic to some extent in the sense of what's driving, I think, Korean growth and potentially to the upside in 26, which is artificial intelligence and semiconductor exports. What we saw in December of this year was a massive surge in semiconductor exports from Korea to the tune of 40% year on year, and a large increase in overall trade surplus. And so I think there is real potential if the AI if AI remains the dominant economic force in 2026, which I think many people assess is true, that Korea stands to be in a great position to take advantage of that. And so, from my personal perspective, I think they're to the upside of a couple of points, maybe over 2% growth, as opposed to the sub 2% growth that the IMF is putting out there.
Great. Naveen, can I turn to you? Do you have any comments on what the audience, how they voted?
Well, first, can you hear me? I think I'm going to focus on the 31% that voted on Malaysia. But first, let me just say, strongly agree with what both Phil and Adam said, which is if you think both of global trade agenda and tariffs, as well as the AI boom, these are two of the big global macro drivers to think about in answering this question. I would say the following, which is that if you look at those numbers from the fund, my former colleagues, I think that the India numbers are already pricing in relatively high growth, and it's worth considering what the risks are, whether it's infrastructure bottlenecks, other such things. I agree with what Adam said. It'll probably be a little bit of a lift for Korea in terms of growth. Ilaria will weigh in more on China, but I think, as Phil said, if the agenda is around fiscal easing, it'll take some heft and push to break through those numbers. And Japan, obviously, there's some challenges there. The thing that's relative to the fund forecast that I don't think they have priced in enough is the surprise to the upside in Malaysia for three reasons. One is massive investments around data centers, including from a number of major American companies. You know who those are. Reshoring of electronics manufacturing, including from China, and chips packaging. So I think that there is probably an upside relative to what's priced in for Malaysia that people are underestimating. So if you're asking for what could be the surprise, I would probably say that one.
Okay, great, thank you. Ilaria, let's turn to you for the China piece. Just 10% of our audience think that China is going to exceed expectations. And again, those forecasts from the IMF project 4.5% growth this year.
Which isn't bad, right? And so I would say, I think that we just need to keep in mind what the actual growth projections are, right? So if you're actually expecting China to grow more than 4.5%, I think that's a lot, right? But considering that the Chinese economy has had a lot of challenges, and it is in a phase where we're seeing also the government really pushing much more sort of techno-industrial policy, right? Innovation rather than rapid growth. And then in addition to that, there's all these structural issues with consumption, low confidence, and in addition to sort of the long-term issues and demographics, et cetera, in China. So I think there's definitely a lot of reasons why the audience here, wasn't super confident that China would see such high growth rates. One thing, and I'll note, and I think this is in line with what everybody else said, I think global trade and what happens to global trade, not just with the United States, I think globally is really going to matter a lot for all these countries, certainly for China, right? I think there was news just today on the China surplus being record high. So the Chinese economy is more dependent than ever on exports. And so what happens to those exports is going to matter a lot for the Chinese economy, which in a certain odd way, right? I mean, I think, from externally, there's been a lot of complaints about, the Chinese surpluses, Chinese exports, overcapacity. But from the Chinese perspective as well, it adds a big level of volatility, right? Your economy is dependent on whether or not other countries put in tariffs. And, that's not, impossible. Certainly, the likelihood may be increasing of more tariffs coming through in other countries aside from the United States, where we already know those tariffs are.
That's interesting. Where would you be looking to if you think of countries that might start imposing tariffs on Chinese imports?
Well, I think the European Union, being a huge market, is the place to watch. Now, There may actually be, there's been recent news that there may have been a deal that is underway on electric vehicles, which has been one of the most controversial tariffs between the U.S. and China, the EU and China. So actually, the tariffs may go away if there is some sort of agreement there, which may, may include some sort of voluntary quotas on exports and price controls, et cetera. But I think that's definitely an area to watch. There's also, certain emerging markets, as much as China has been fairly popular in the global south, and many countries are seeking to expand their relationship with China, especially in terms of investment, there are also a lot of concerns about trade, right? So I think you might still see, in certain sectors at least, more tariffs popping up. And I think, there's depending on the country, the sectors are different because this outflow of exports from China grows across the board in a lot of different sectors.
I don't think we've talked about Japan much yet. So our audience in the first panel were really confident that Prime Minister Takaichi is going to really increase her domestic power. But the audience doesn't seem to think that that's going to result in increased economic growth. What are you watching for when it comes to Japan? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on this.
I would just say briefly that I think there's huge outstanding questions geopolitically for Japan. It's important, obviously, not to ignore the baseline economic problems that Japan is facing and big questions about how effective Takaichi's government can be in pushing forward stimulus and whether that stimulus actually hits the parts of the economy that lead to growth as opposed to just handouts that don't do that. I think, obviously we're in a different paradigm now with increasing rates in Japan. So bond growth is a whole new topic that disappeared for the better half of the last several decades. But obviously I'm more geopolitically minded, but I find myself continually coming back to this question of what China trade will look like and how Takaichi can manage the growing nationalism and demands for standing up for Japan and its economic requirements and its relationship with China. And so far we have not seen Beijing actually put its foot down and on these dual use controls that it's put forward. We're just hearing inklings of small halts here and there, but even a temporary stoppage in critical minerals exports to Japan could have a tangible impact on growth for the year. And so, while labor remains a major issue and core domestic issues, I think that, if not resolved, would be detrimental to its growth.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like you and the audience did pretty well in question one. It seems like broad alignment that Malaysia is a place to watch, India is a place to watch, less so China, Japan, and perhaps South Korea. So let's see if you can keep it up. Moving on to question two now, and please do read this because the answers are really tiny, so I'm going to read them out for you. So now we're talking about US economic policy to China. So the most significant trend in US economic policy towards China this year will be relaxing export controls and outbound investment screening, joint action by US and allies on Chinese economic coercion, additional tariffs on Chinese imports, a stabilization of bilateral economic ties via symmetry, or broader attempts at decoupling. Okay. I'm seeing the stabilization of bilateral economic ties seems to be in the head. We have that expected meeting between President Trump and President Xi in April, I think. Oh, it's losing ground. Oh, I need to do what Rick said. I need to do the horse racing thing. Oh, and we have decoupling is taking over. All right, wow, okay. People are still voting. A late surge for decoupling. Oh, joint action, okay. All right, let's pause it there. Okay, I think we have lots to discuss here. So I'm going to start by reading out the results. So just in the head, most of our audience, 28%, think broad attempts at decoupling will be the most significant trend to watch in US economic policy toward China. Just behind and evenly with 26%, we have both joint action by US and allies on Chinese economic coercion, and also a stabilization of bilateral economic ties via symmetry. And then trailing somewhat, we have relaxing export controls and outbound investment screening at 11%. And finally, additional tariffs on Chinese imports languishing at 8%. And I should say, I just checked, I don't think we have any news yet. If anyone has heard, okay, it seems like the ruling is not coming out today. So, okay, Adam, can I turn to you first? What do you think? Are you surprised by these results?
I think initially I was, but now that I think about it, I think not, in the sense that I think folks are actually keying in on what has become the trend over the past year, which is many things, sometimes seeming contradictory, all happening at once. And so I think keeping in mind that this year remains a real question mark, particularly in the China relationship, it is not surprising that we're seeing a trend at the working level, and significantly when we look at some core imports and critical minerals, for instance, of the United States making large efforts from a monetary perspective to build out an industry to separate itself from China, to limit its exposure. But at the same time, we also see it not taking the actions to bring together its partners and allies to actually address many of these industries that it relies on China for most. And while the total imports from China, while the United States makes up less of total imports from China, it's the reality is when we look at the tariff spread, that China does not actually sit that far above many of the other major producers in Southeast Asia in terms of tariff ratings right now, with the potential in the stability narrative for it to fall even further if the United States decides to remove the remaining 10% fentanyl tariff, which would actually make the delta between the relative tariff on exporters in Southeast Asia and China smaller than it was at the beginning of the administration. So you have the potential to actually undermine decoupling very quickly with a huge potential influx of Chinese goods at lower prices. But what I want to talk mostly about is this, I think, really interesting narrative on stability, because the reality is a year ago, none of us would have sat here and said that that was likely to be the trend, even in 26, that the key macroeconomic and geopolitical environments that both countries are sitting in would lead in the opposite direction. But leading up to and now following their APEC meeting, I think we've seen a clear shift, and the audience is caught on to that and put it up high. And we've seen the Trump administration in particular softening its stance, backing off on many of its most aggressive demands of China, kind of touting this deal and this trade agreement, which, while making some progress in kind of tactical areas, doesn't change the strategic economic relationship in any way. And all of that points to, seems to be related to President Trump's personal desire to maintain a strong relationship with President Xi, which is guiding much of how he is engaging right now, and his desire to go to Beijing, as you said, in April. And we've seen the administration actually adjusting its posture significantly to keep things in a stable position. And I'll point to three things. One was this rather abrupt shift in the timing of soybean shipments to the United States. Initially, China was expected to deliver buy 12 million metric tons of soybeans by December 31st or January 1st. But all of a sudden, the Treasury came out and said, actually, that date was the end of February. So a two-month addition to them. And they did not meet that initial number, and they're still behind right now. On top of that, we had two major incidents in East Asia. We had one of the largest military exercises around Taiwan, Justice Mission 2025, and we have this huge increase in economic tensions between China and Japan. And on both accounts, the administration has remained incredibly quiet, with the president himself basically refraining from any condemnation whatsoever. And I think that all points to this desire at the top levels to keep the relationship on a stable path. And the other portion of this, though, too, is the practical reality of China's economic dominance, and particularly dominance in critical minerals and rare earths. I think there is deep concern as they look towards the midterms and this question of affordability, of taking any chances and risks with China that could increase prices in the United States and increase stress on the US economy, both in general and also in particular as you go towards November and the midterm election. Now, I would caveat all that with there are lots of issues that could arise, and I think history points to the fact that despite efforts like this in the past, stability is not long-lasting in this relationship. And when we look at the first Trump administration, we saw many efforts to de-escalate, quickly followed by escalation, both by the United States and China. And even just looking back into 2025 and these high-level meetings between Secretary Bessent and his counterpart, we'd have very positive prognostications come out, and then almost immediately fall right back into a crisis-like scenario, whether it be due to Chinese actions on export controls or US actions on export controls, particularly when we're looking at advanced technology. So with all that in mind, I think more so than at any point, it looks like, at least for the first half of this year, we see stability is more likely. And everything right now is pointing more in the direction of that lasting longer than shorter, but risks certainly do remain.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. Ilaria, can I bring in you next? Does any of this surprise you?
Well, I mean, I think the results are very similar for very different sort of, right? Very divergent. So, but I agree that, I mean, look, if we look at last year, we had all of the above, right? You know, you had moments of decoupling, or at least attempts at decoupling, moments of stabilization. I would say what we haven't really seen is really strong joint action with U.S. trade partners. Or, you know, allies. So that part actually surprised me a little bit. You know, I haven't seen evidence of, especially joint economic action. I don't think that I've seen a lot of evidence for that. Of course, that may change. I think certainly a lot of U.S. allies would welcome that. I would welcome U.S. leadership in sort of creating more of a sort of joint approach to China, but that doesn't seem to be how things are proceeding, and I think, you know, the preference of this administration is to really proceed on a bilateral basis, and you know, I think there's certainly a lot of tension with allies on the economic front. So I think that's one area where I might maybe disagree a little bit with the audience. But I think, you know, in general, it's entirely possible that we might, you know, as was just said, right, that we might have a period of stabilization for the next few months, and that might not hold, right? I think it's fairly likely that depending on, you know, a lot of the structural issues, a lot of the export controls are still in place, so all the irritants are still there, right? So you could have a very quick escalation. In fact, you know, even some, you know, actions that may not be specifically targeted at the United States or China may act as irritants as well. And so you might see escalation because of that as well.
What kinds of things are you thinking about that? I mean, we just saw with Iran, the president just announced 25% tariffs on countries that trade with Iran. China is one of those.
Certainly, yes. That would actually certainly be one of those areas. And then also, you know, you have companies operating that may create situations that are, you know, that may not be entirely predicted. You might have a balloon, right? You know, you really can't exclude certain situations that are not necessarily entirely predictable. And I think we've seen a lot in the ups and downs in the U.S.-China relationship that are, you know, really take the relationship in a very different direction because of sort of one specific action. So I think, you know, we know right now that President Trump is really committed to stabilizing relations. So I think we can count on that for now, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to have some sort of change that might happen more quickly than you expect.
And this feels like a political lifetime ago. So for those who've forgotten the balloon, that was, of course, the spy balloon, or as I think the Chinese denied, it was a spy balloon that floated over North America. Phil, Naveen, anything to add on the broad trends to watch for on U.S. economic policy towards China?
Yeah, I'll be brief, but I first just completely agree with both Adam and Ilaria on this. I mean, the first thing is, between decoupling versus stabilization, yes, and. I mean, you're going to see like day to day, those are going to be wobble back and forth, and agency to agency potentially wobbling back and forth. I'd say two things though. I mean, I think to the degree to which we see stabilization, I think that stabilization is going to come out of sort of partly fears about prices. I think that's in some days like overdue, I think. But also out of sort of like a paralysis in sense of we're not dealing with the sort of core issues around the relationship, right? Like how do we deal with the huge imbalances on both sides? Their overproduction, our overconsumption, we're two sides of the same coin. How do we sort of get back to a world that makes more sense? We're not dealing with that. What is it okay for us to buy from them and sell to them? We're doing it in a very one-off sort of way. So, I mean, I think to the degree to which we have stabilization, it's going to be stabilization with all those big questions left TBD. Also, completely agree with Ilariot on I was surprised by the 26% on the sort of coordination. God, I would love that. I'd love that to be a headline coming out of 2026. If that's the case, I'm going to take some amount of credit, whether it's due or not. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge area where the last administration, we put a lot of focus on this. And this was not out of altruism. And I think this is one thing that I hope this administration, can start to appreciate more. Helping your partners deal with threats of economic coercion from the PRC is helping them do things that are broadly in line with your interests as well. Right? I mean, if you think about, why Japan is facing this coercion now, it's because they said that they would probably be drawn into a Taiwan contingency, which is obviously what the Department of Defense has been asking partners a lot lately, is like, what would you do in this situation, right? So, there's a lot of countries who have interests aligned with ours, who would like to do things that are aligned with our interests, who may not do so if they don't see the potential benefits, to them of U.S. support. So that I would love to be the case, but I'm also skeptical.
And someone else who might like to take some credit for that is Victor Cha, who has a new book out about Chinese economic coercion, and we have an event next week on that, so I hope that you will join us for that. I think it's on Wednesday at 2 p.m.?
I'll share a little bit of the
3 p.m., 3 p.m. Okay, yeah. Naveen, final word from you.
That was a smooth plug.
Yeah.
Great reflections on the part of all the panelists here. I would add the following. You could look at the questions you're asking as our assessment of the varied goals of the administration and our assessment of what will reality be. There are two questions. It'd be interesting to see what people thought in their minds when they answered it. I actually think that the big picture, and I'll kind of lean on what Phil said, is we are in the kind of an economic détente because of it's a recognition that U.S. leverage relative to what the Trump administration thought they had when they came in is far less. So the U.S. is actually a lot more constrained than it realizes. And so the notion of we can use leverage and coercion to sort of force a remaking of the global economic order is running up against a wall. And so that's why if stabilization means our hands are tied and we're going to have to live with this reality, I would tend to agree with that. I think that decoupling is too diffuse a notion for me and too complicated to think that it's actually going to happen. I think there are many cross currents there. And so I would just say I tend to agree with this thing that we're constrained. And so what is that world going to be like? I'd just say one last thing. When the Liberation Day happened in the subsequent weeks and months, you did hear very different things from people in the administration. President Trump at some point talked about a deal, kind of a deal of all deals with China. Secretary Bessent talked about how he would have the administration would aspire to an encirclement strategy with allies, which is kind of like your second question there. And then you negotiate with China. But just the approach and the conduct of American trade policy and American economic policy has been so scattershot, I think, that you can't isolate China, nor can you rely on the partners because you're going at everybody at the same time. And so, again, I think maybe there will be lessons learned, although my expectations that lessons will be internalized is probably low.
Okay, great. Let's bring in the audience again. Question 3. So now we're talking about what will dominate the debate on US-China economic competition this year. So we have AI, semiconductors, quantum, clean energy, or critical minerals. 100% critical minerals, okay. Okay, wow. I'm going to leave it for a little bit, but No takers for clean energy. All right, that seems quite decisive. Let's pause it there. So just to read out the results, so we have 66% of the audience think that critical minerals is going to dominate the debate on US-China economic competition this year. Following way behind AI at 19%, semiconductors at 15%, and then no takers for quantum or clean energy. Ilaria, let me bring you in first here. I know you do a lot of work on clean energy.
No, but I don't disagree.
Okay, great. Tell me why.
I mean, if you want to, clean energy is certainly a very important sector in China. So if you follow the Chinese economy, this certainly is going to be, continue to be a big industry. But it's just not a priority of the current administration in the United States. And I think, generally speaking, already in the previous administration, we had moved towards sort of like limiting, there's a lot of debates on how much Chinese technology could be allowed in the US, and those will continue to a certain extent, but it's just not going to be a big priority. On my list, I had either critical minerals or semiconductors, because those are the two sectors where we still have export controls. So I think they're sort of the two sides of the coin in any conversation or discussion or deal between the US and China. I think those will be the two sort of trading chips that the two countries will be using or discussing, or at least I think that's that's certainly, I think, in the Chinese are hoping that's going to be the case, right? Given that semiconductors up until recently were seen as something that was non-negotiable, export controls on semiconductors, that is. But more recently, we've seen some softening. So I think that's certainly, I think, the hope in Beijing. So I don't disagree. I mean, I think the other thing to point to is in relation to the previous discussion we had, this sort of fragile balance that we have right now is in no small part thanks to the fact that we have export controls that have weaponized both semiconductors on the US side and critical mineral, well, specifically rare earths on the Chinese side, right? So I think, that's not resolved. I think, as Phil was saying, we haven't, the structural issues, but even the tactical sort of weapons that the US and China have are all still in place, right? And they're pointed right at each other. And in fact, they're not just pointed at each other. In the case of rare earths, it's like pointed at the whole world, right? So I think that's all, I think, relevant. In terms of AI, I would just say AI is part of that mix, right? Because all the export controls on semiconductors are really actually trying to get to China's AI capabilities. And so I think, that I generally agree with the assessment there. And I'll just say, quantum we all know is really important, but unless there's like a huge breakthrough, I just don't see it dominating the relationship the way that critical minerals and some of these other technologies will.
Okay. Great. Naveen, I want to turn to you next. Now, next week, you have a big report coming out from your department on tech competition between the US and China. You see all the plugs I'm putting in? I'll collect my fee later. So
I already prepaid.
So what's that? What do you think this sounds right to you?
In terms of this question, and then I'll come to the report, I agree, and I think Ilaria said something important, which is the big driver is AI, and you look at the AI stack, and the things you have in there are part of the AI stack. So the frontier models and the approach, the diffusion versus going for AGI, the chips that go into data centers, I would say the digital networks and the critical minerals, energy is there as well. So this is not surprising, and in effect, they're not disagreeing with each other. It's just like, but the thing that I would say is not on this list, and which would be interesting to get people's reactions, is life sciences. And so if you look at biotech and life sciences, just look at Chinese R&D and research. It is outpacing the United States, currently outpacing the United States in scale, maybe not quality, but certainly in scale. And, I just would reference Senator Young chaired National Security Commission on Biotech earlier, it was last year, really eye-opening insights as to what's happening around synthetic biology, various parts of biotech pharma as well. So that might have maybe been a potential winner there as well. And that brings me to this report. I mean, what we're doing is trying to take a look at U.S.-China competition, technology competition from a slightly different perspective. And the two insights are basically that to win, you need to win on acceleration technologies, those that will have an outsized impact on productivity, on growth, on has security implications and global influence. Obviously, stack technologies like AI, closer to general purpose, are important there. But they're related to other technologies, including rare earths and including high-end machine tools. And so one of our points is that you have to be able to play all the keys. That doesn't mean you don't have focus, but you have to be able to play all the keys, which may include having strong alliances with those that do things that you don't do. Say, for example, high-end machine tools, which Phil has analyzed in that report. And so I think that's one message. 2 is defend your networks. And 3, of course, we must achieve speed and scale, which is probably one of the gaps for the U.S. relative to China in some of these areas. So it's going to be an interesting report. We cover all these different technologies, stack technologies like AI, production technologies like high-end machine tools, precision technologies like jet engines, and of course, base technologies like rare earths and critical minerals, steel and aluminum. So look out for the report, but it doesn't disagree with what the audience has said here. So.
Okay, great, great. Phil, Adam, anything you want to add before we move on?
I'll be really quick.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take this slightly differently, which is I agree with this in general. If you're thinking, the question is like, whose debate? I think domestically, I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of debate about critical minerals because I think we all understand, largely speaking, we understand what we have to do. It's just really hard and expensive to do it. So I think that in some sense, there's like more clarity on that. I think there'll be more sort of like, there's more two sides in some sense, or on the semiconductor issue. I think, there's genuine issues around sort of, promote and protect, and this administration has sort of moved differently than the last. And so I think both of these issues are not going away, semiconductors and critical minerals, as Ilaria noted. China will keep those tools in place. They will continue to develop the extraterritorial nature of those tools, as will we. But I think semiconductors is going to be an interesting one because there's a huge issue around how do we deal with Chinese overcapacity in this space? What do we sell them versus what do we not sell them? How do we deal with the next Xperia? I think there's a lot of issues there that are, not saying critical minerals is simple, but in some sense it's a simpler problem with just a very expensive solution.
So I would just quickly take it in a slightly different direction. I actually read this question differently than I think the audience, and so landed in a different place. Because from my perspective, the frame by which people will judge the tech competition over the next year is exclusively through AI. And obviously, I agree wholeheartedly with what has been said in terms of how, in many ways, all of this plays into AI. But the reality is right now, you have a dynamic where China is perceived to be 3 to 6 months behind the United States in frontier models, although up for debate when you look at specific measures. And with the evolving U.S. export control regime and the willingness now to sell the H-200, and maybe, who knows what comes out of a meeting in April, if higher-end chips could be sold, there is a potential to see China actually moving faster. And the question this year will be, does China catch up? Are we looking at Chinese frontier models outpacing American companies? And the resulting impact of that, of how these models start to build out and dominate the ecosystem globally of AI. And so while I think all of the other topics are important, minus quantum, although it is very important, it's just not commercially viable at this point, I think AI will be the measure by which we look at this competition at the end of the year.
Great, thank you so much. So let's move on then to our last question in this panel. So in 2026, US tariff policy vis-a-vis Asian allies and partners will most likely, again, read this carefully please, intensify across the board as a diplomatic tool, soften relative to other regions, remain unchanged, or unravel after multiple exemptions to manage rising prices. And again, my sources who are watching the Supreme Court say this decision has not come down today. So we still don't know what's happening with IEEPA. Thank you, Nina, for keeping me up to date. Okay, I'll give you a couple more seconds to respond to this. Okay, I think we have a winner. Let's pause it there. So with just over 50%, 50% of the audience think that US tariff policy vis-a-vis Asian allies and partners will unravel after multiple exemptions to manage rising prices. After that, we think, or the audience thinks, a quarter of the audience thinks that tariff policy will soften relative to other parts of the world. Then some people think no real change here, and 4% think they will intensify. So it seems like a shift away from tariffs on US allies and partners in Asia. Naveen, let me turn to you first for this. What do you think?
Well, I go back, so I kind of would like the 50% to be true. The 50% of you who voted for that last one, I'm with you. But I am skeptical for the following reason. There's literally nothing that the administration has done or shown us that says that the goal of using tariffs to achieve all kinds of, the choice of using tariffs as the instrument of choice for all kinds of goals is not going to go away. So even if they lose or even are constrained by the IEEPA ruling, there will be these other mechanisms, 232, 301, 338, all these long list of numbers in the code, they will use those. And so I don't see that going away. Two is I don't see the region softening relative to others because it's the actual epicenter of what many of the administration folks look at as the goods trade, merchandise trade deficits, and we have to address them. So again, my heart is with you on that 50%, but I just don't see that happening. I just think we got 3 years of more of this sort of thing, so.
But more of this rather than intensifying, you think?
It depends on the constraints that they face. Some of them are going to be endogenous because of the courts. Some of it will be exogenous because of lack of leverage. But will the administration stop seeking to use some form of tariff mechanism to address any number of goals, reindustrialization, deficits, so on and so forth? I don't see that happening.
Okay. Phil?
Yeah,
Tariffs.
first I would just say, from your thumbs to God's ears on the 50%, yes, hopefully that's true. I agree. I don't think it's going to unravel them quite that way. I also don't think it's going to intensify. But, for the audience, I think we shifted this from 1 to 4 because of the timing, right?
Yeah.
Which was smart. Because it really does depend a lot on the courts here, in part because, the way in which the administration has used it at the sort of country level across all products, this deftly, with this much dexterity, is really a function of IEEPA, the law that's being considered here. So if just imagine that goes away, the most standard tools then, or the tools that they can sort of use the easiest or most easily, are 301 tariffs, which are country specific, which they already have on China, so that allows us to increase or decrease tariffs. But as we've said, there's a lot of reasons why we would sort of want to, keep our powder dry there. And then the other issues are sectoral tariffs, right? So that's going to be much less country and region specific, right? And those are going to stick around. So steel and aluminum sticking around, autos sticking around. We'll eventually get something on semiconductors, right? So I think, if that goes away as a tool, and I can't imagine it not being curtailed a little bit, I think that by itself will sort of mean that we're not going to see that intensification. And it also means that it's a little bit less easily used as a sort of diplomatic tool as the 4% we're thinking. The one thing I will say where I think, you might have sort of a softening, remaining unchanged, something in there, which is, I completely agree with Naveen that this is a core tenet of this administration, that trade policy is a tool, that access to the US market is used as leverage to get any number of things you want to get. I don't think they're going to be like, oh, guys, turns out we were wrong, right? So they're not going to do that publicly. But you have seen a lot of cases where they'll put tariffs up to 50% and then exempt USMCA eligible products, or exempt products that cannot be gotten from coffee, which can't be produced in the United States, or things like that. Or you take all sorts of exemptions get taken. So there's been sort of this push and pull where the actual observed tariff rate So there's two ways you can sort of measure it, to get a little wonky for a second. Two ways you can measure sort of tariffs on average. One is what's the applied tariff, like in the books, and what's the share of trade that's coming in under that code, and you just get a weighted average that way. By that, the average tariff rate right now is like 16-17%. Or you can actually look at receipts. How much stuff did we import, and how much did we collect in tariffs? There's a huge delta there. It's like 16% versus like 8 or 9%, right? So there's a lot of exemptions and things that are happening, right? So you can see that is partly in terms of policy, which is as affordability becomes more of a challenge, even if the rhetoric doesn't really change, you can see sort of a dialing back of some of these things, which would affect our partners as well.
Great. Adam, over to you. Any final words before we wrap up?
So I think stability is what we're likely to see this year, and I'll go at it from both angles, from the up and down side. On the downside, I think we've hit it, but IEEPA and the court ruling, while significant in a question of IEEPA, I just do not think will have a major impact on overall tariff rates. The administration is set to use Section 122, which would allow it to instantly put 10 to 15% on the globe, and then 301 investigations, which will go from their 60,000 word normal to 500 words and a footnote, and they will roll those out for every country as fast as they need to. And I think you'll see rates remain relatively unchanged. And moreover, I think countries are not going to look to try and upset this balance, particularly in Northeast Asia and U.S. allies in particular. On the downside, I think Phil is absolutely right. There's been tons of exclusions. I mean, to the tune of $1 trillion. Major consumer goods, electronics, food, et cetera. But they've done basically what they're going to do there. I think they've hit the major categories. There are a handful of things maybe that could come, but we're not going to, I don't think we'd expect much to change there. And then lastly, on 232s, we're still expecting something on semiconductors, but more and more, I think, our impression is that it will fall in line with what they did with pharma, which they rolled out a massive 100% tariff on pharma, but it turned out it applies to basically no one. And I think that's what we're likely to see on semiconductors, with exemptions for any company that is investing or thinking of investing or has a friend who's investing in the United States. So stability seems to be my take for now.
Great, thank you. Ilaria.
I think everything has been said.
Okay.
But I mean, I just like underline that I think, yes, we'll probably see on average, things will stay relatively similar, but we might see shuffling around, right? Instead of a country-wide tariff, you might get like a sectoral tariff that's still going to hit most of the exports of that country, right? And so I think, on the whole, we'll still probably be in a very similar position on average, even though maybe there might be some not insignificant changes along the way, right? Yeah.
Great, okay, so just a quick recap then. So on the countries most likely to exceed economic growth projections, the audience said India and Malaysia. I think broad agreement across the panel here. The second one on US economic policy with China is kind of all over the place. And I think the audience just said decoupling is what they expect most. I think some disagreements from the stage, but in part that's because there are so many things that could change over this coming year, and we might see quite big fluctuations in the broad economic policy on China. Critical minerals and AI seem to be the biggest areas that we should watch out for, but Naveen, you added look out for life sciences as well. And also look out for his big report next week.
Ours.
Yours, sorry, or your whole department's. And then finally, I think, there's some hope from experts on the stage that tariffs will begin to unravel, but I think you all seem to think that they're going to remain a fixture going forward. And so Asian allies and partners are going to have to sort of adapt to this new normal, as it were, in some way. So thank you so much, Naveen, Phil, Adam, Ilaria, for joining me. Thank you to the audience for your answers. It seems like you did a pretty good job, according to our experts on the stage.
Thanks you for a brilliantly orchestrated panel.
And please stick around, because our next panel is going to be on security. Just a couple of final flags from me. When that decision about IEEPA does come down, look out for a roundup of our expected geopolitical responses from different parts of the world from the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department. Again, tomorrow we have that episode of State of Play coming out with predictions, but that our experts' boldest predictions for what they expect to see this year. And again, we'll take a quick 5-minute break or so, and then we'll reconvene. So thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. If you could take your seats, we'll get started in just a minute. All right, welcome back to our final panel. I know a few people are still trickling in, but we have an online audience as well, so I want to kick this off. We only have an hour. I am Catherine Pack. I'm a senior fellow and deputy director with the Australia chair here at CSIS, and I'd like to welcome you to this final panel titled Regional Security Dynamics, China, Russia, and North Korea. So we're ending on a high or low note. I'm not sure which one, but we'll see. I'm joined here today by 5 of my CSIS colleagues. I've got Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies. Tom Christensen, he's the Pritzker Chair in the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department. Bonnie Lin, Senior Advisor and Director of the China Power Project. Sid Seiler is a non-resident Senior Advisor with the Korea Chair. And Maria Snagovaya is a Senior Fellow for Russia, Russia and Eurasia with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program. So thank you all for joining me today. So we're going to go right into our first question. I think everyone has it by now in terms of the QR code. Do we need to flash that up again, or they got it? Okay. First question. Blank will have the greatest impact on regional security dynamics in 2026? India, North Korea, Russia, or China? So get your votes in. We'll leave it open for a few more moments. I guess there's a few different ways to interpret this one. I think we have a clear runner.
Like you can watch it like a horse race.
I know, it's great. It's great. Yeah, and China's in the lead. Okay.
Russia's pulling up behind them.
Russia's pulling up. All right, let's close out the voting. So clear lead in China. Also 23% for Russia, 7% for North Korea, and 2% for India. Let's turn to you first, Henrietta, for your thoughts on this. Do you agree with the China stat?
I do. I hope we have time for Q&A. I want to hear from who hit the India button, because that is such an optimistic human being. I want to hear their perspective. So I do agree with the 68% of the audience that thinks China will have the greatest impact on regional security dynamics in 2026, for 2 reasons. So there's the bigger picture where, of course, of those countries, China really is the one power with the will, the intent, the capability to reshape the entirety of the international order to be more friendly to China's system of government, to marginalize U.S. leadership. They have an incredibly ambitious project of global leadership, and as the viability of the United States' own commitment to leadership in the world becomes a little more complicated, I think China is very well positioned to set the terms of the debate for the security picture going forward in the coming year. But I would want to just raise one other factor, because we're talking about not necessarily China's global impact, but its regional impact, what this means for the Indo-Pacific. And we've seen over the past year, China really double down on its engagement, on its strategy with its neighborhood in its region. Thinking back to last year in April, Xi Jinping addressed the first ever central work conference on work related to the periphery, which is really important in kind of the Chinese communist system. Basically has Xi signaling that the most important region for our foreign policy, for our competition with the US, for our efforts to build a more favorable international order, all of that is happening first and foremost in Asia, in our neighborhood, and that needs to be the priority. So I think we will see China continue to play a determining role in regional security dynamics going forward.
Tom, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think China for sure, simply because it has the greatest economic, military, and diplomatic power, and as Henrietta said so well, it's focused on the region. I think it's not all influence that will serve China's interest necessarily. We heard this morning that despite serious headwinds in the U.S. alliance system related to economic tensions and other policies and concerns in the region about the rules-based international order and whether the Trump administration is challenging that rules-based international order, that the alliances are actually still very strong. Now, why is that? That's because China has been so assertive toward its neighborhood and has driven countries to say we really don't have any choice but to strengthen our relationships with the United States despite these headwinds. So these are tailwinds in the U.S. alliance sense. In terms of Russia, I'm surprised that Russia gets 23% because I think Russian influence in the Indo-Pacific is largely channeled through China. So they do exercises with China near Korea and Japan, thus getting those countries more concerned about Russia. They do things in Ukraine that China backs, which gets countries like Korea and Japan very worried about China because they're backing Russia when Russia is aggressive in another area. But I don't see Russia as being very, very influential. I'm surprised that North Korea is so low simply because North Korea is the one actor besides China that could really upset everything by doing something really, really destabilizing. And Sid's here, so he can say more about that. But I just think that North Korea could be the most influential if it does something catastrophically terrible. But otherwise, I don't think North Korea is going to be the most influential.
Bonnie, are you going to stay with the trend on China?
Yes. So I do agree with both Henrietta and Tom, not surprisingly. well, also, you have 3 China experts in a row, so... I guess what I would add to what the excellent comments Henrietta and Tom had is looking at security dynamics in terms of the trend that we saw in 2025, if we see those trends accelerate, I think it's definitely going to be China. So for example, if you look at dynamics in the South China Sea, we just had the Philippine government share early this year that when they were observing Chinese activities in the South China Sea, they saw that it was no longer just Chinese Coast Guard activities, but they specifically said that PLA naval activities in the South China Sea had become much more consistent and normal compared to 2024, where PLA naval activities were at most periodic and episodic. So now in the South China Sea, we're seeing a lot more Chinese activity, both on the Coast Guard side as well as on the PLA Navy side. In Japan, I think we've really seen China escalate coercion against Japan after Prime Minister Takaichi's statements in early November from the Diet, and that coercion is across the board, not only military but also economic. And it's quite fascinating to see how that could continue to, I think, escalate, because I don't see any willingness on the Chinese side to back down from that statement. Last but not least, the other example I'll point out is in Taiwan. I know a lot of us have been very focused on the U.S. operation in Venezuela recently, but right before New Year's, China did another major military exercise opposite of Taiwan Justice Mission 2025. Of course, it was not the same scale as Operation Absolute Resolve, but it still had over 200 sorties of Chinese aircraft. It involved, I believe, about 30 or more Chinese PLA naval vessels, as well as Coast Guard vessels, and involved a live fire of China using live fire rocket drills around Taiwan. So if we project those trends for 2026, I would expect a lot more Chinese activity, both military as well as other course of activity in the region.
Sid, over to you. Thoughts on Korea?
Well, I'm no fool to challenge the China experts here, but let me, before I talk about North Korea, kind of reiterate my support for that assessment that China is, and its behavior will be very interesting. I think equally important related to it is how this administration's China policy will evolve through the events that will take place this year. If Donald Trump is able to confidently say that Xi Jinping has promised him he won't move on Taiwan during his presidency, if there's some type of accommodation on the economic issues between our two countries, we could look at we won't use the competition and cooperation language that we did back in the Obama administration, but there will be areas of cooperation that will be made possible where the president, because he's got other foreign policy and domestic challenges much greater than China, how much effort he is going to put into maintaining a hard line on China is questionable, and some of the language of those seeking the Asia pivot, the further greater attention on China as our primary, not enemy, but security concern, those voices may get lost in a more conciliatory relationship between the two leaders. North Korea has pursued its nuclear program for some 35 years in a zone that is always troubling, but never so intense and so potentially explosive that we would take the type of actions that could have made a difference. And so North Korea has been very good at calibrating its behavior in a way that keeps it on everybody's menu, but it doesn't get them in the type of trouble, particularly now with these shifts in the global order, where Security Council actions on North Korea don't concern Pyongyang. The ability to sit down with Donald Trump is not at the top of Kim Jong-un's list. The state of inter-Korea relations is of little interest to Kim Jong-un. And so just this kind of, I'm a nuclear power, what are you going to do about it? But I'm not out to pick fights with anybody. I can be a responsible nuclear power. In support of that narrative, I think it's less likely that we will see something shocking that had great impact. We'll see missile launches, we'll see military exercises, we'll see increases in rhetoric, but not anything that I think that fundamentally would want to drive that number much beyond 7%.
So Maria, how do you read the 23% up here?
Yeah, well, I think Russia's President Vladimir Putin would be happy to see this outcome. But altogether, clearly I agree with my previous colleagues that key impact of Russia definitely and increasingly is channeled through helping China, in diluting the US-led deterrence of China over the last years. And that's communicated through a number of channels with our colleagues here, including Bonnie. We have co-authored a number of reports on the formation of the so-called CRINC axis that focuses specifically on the diplomatic, security, and economic cooperation among the countries. And what clearly stands out from this analysis is that while definitely Iran and North Korea play a role, the key node of the relationship is driven by Russia-China, and that is very clearly deepening over the last years and surpasses purely tactical considerations, especially when it comes to security cooperation. So we're definitely talking about alignment, ideological alignment that might be a problem going forward. So Russia has participated in a number of joint military exercises with China. There is deepening political diplomatic coordination in the forums like the United Nations, the SCO. There is, broadly speaking, arms sales when it comes to the regional dynamic, but it's more difficult for Russia these days since it's seriously overstretched in Ukraine and has limited ability to continue arms sales everywhere. We also obviously see the deepening coordination with North Korea and Russia allegedly assisting it even with its nuclear program, given the last findings and data. And of course, it's also selling energy to China. But for Russia, the main theater, obviously, European theater, it remains deeply focused on Ukraine. The progress is very limited at best of the so-called second army in the world. It's not going anywhere, and the attrition is tremendous. By the way, the fun fact, the duration of the war in Ukraine just exceeded the duration of so-called Great Patriotic War, which is how Russia described Soviet Union's participation in the Second World War, which is absolutely key focus, like the of the regime. So it's not going far, and to the extent that Europe is concerned, China definitely appears committed not to let Russia lose, and learning a lot of lessons from the war in Ukraine. So I think going forward, this deepening bilateral coordination between the two countries is going to be a defining feature of this year.
Great, let's move on to the next question. What is the probability of China using significant military force against Taiwan in 2026? 120%. Some optimists or relative optimists out there. Let's give it another few moments. People might be changing their vote. Okay. All right, let's pause it. All right, clearly over 50%, say under 20% chance. But we've got 32% at 40% chance, so just under 50% chance there, and only 6% saying that there is either over a 60% chance or over an 80% chance. A lot of percentages in those answers, but bottom line, mostly a positive outlook relatively. Let's start with Tom on this one.
Thanks a lot. So we just had a little side conversation. I just want to make clear that when I'm looking at this and I think significant military force, I mean actual attack. Right? Not significant military exercises, which I expect to happen. And I think maybe that's how the audience answered. And if it mean attack, I would say under 20% for sure is a good assessment. I think the audience is wise to choose that. But that's not really comforting. So if you think about the insurance industry, let's say there was a 15% chance of a catastrophic fire in your house. You'd have a very expensive insurance policy if you could get one at all. Right? So I don't take great comfort in under 20% in a given calendar year. So I'm very concerned about Taiwan's security. That being said, I think that China has not yet fully prepared all of the military options that its leadership would like to have for Taiwan contingencies. It has options, and I'll return to that in a minute, but it hasn't prepared all of them. The United States and Taiwan in conjunction have tried to make it harder and delay the process by which China can develop all of the military options it would like to have in a cross-strait war. And I think President Xi does not fully trust his military to be effective. That's why you see not why you see, but when you're firing lots and lots of your generals because you don't think they're professionally competent but they're corrupt, that suggests you might not have sufficient faith in your military to carry out complex operations. All that being said, China can do a blockade of Taiwan, a physical blockade of Taiwan, about which Taiwan can do very little, and about which the United States can do very little. The problem with that is it's not necessarily decisive. Diplomatically very risky. It will alienate the whole world because the global economy will probably crash if it happens, and it will hurt China's economy. So it's not something I think China's eager to do. So I don't expect in 2026 China to come to the conclusion that that would be a wise policy, unless politics change in a way where China feels it is the time to do it. And I don't think those politics are in that place right now. One of the reasons is that I think China is relatively confident that their current strategy towards Taiwan is working in the near term. At least they can tell a story. And I think that that is the most important thing. It's about Chinese Communist Party legitimacy and about Xi's reputation for success. And I think they can tell a story that 2025 was a success for their strategy because the recall election in Taiwan failed. The popularity of President Lai is relatively low. So it doesn't look like Taiwan politics is pulling hard in the direction of pro-independence actions in the near term. So they can say, we are succeeding. Whether they believe it or not, they can say it, right? I don't think the United States is likely to change its fundamental policy towards Taiwan in the direction of upgrading political relations in a way that could create a conflict under the Trump 2.0 administration. I think Trump 1.0 administration was leaning in that direction toward the end, but I don't think I see that. So I don't think that that's going to happen. And then I look at 2027 and I get more concerned, and I'll just finish with this. The politics may be in place in 2027 in a way that they're not in 2026. And it's not about military preparation per se. I know a lot of people talk about 2027 in that light. I'm thinking about politics. You have President Xi getting a new term, almost certainly, but wanting to posture in a certain way in that process. You have President Lai running for office for the early 2028 re-election campaign. All sorts of things can happen there. And you have President Trump entering his last year in office, and it's possible that someone in Beijing will come to the conclusion that if they want to get something significant done on Taiwan, they want to do it while President Trump is there, because follow-on administrations may take a more difficult posture towards China on the issue than the Trump administration. I don't know if that'll happen, but I could imagine all of those things coming to the head in 2027, but not 2026.
Interesting on the politics angle there. Bonnie, your thoughts?
So I almost 100% completely agree with what Tom said. So what I will do, though, is highlight some of the, I guess, more divided views of a recent CSIS survey that we commissioned in late December. We just published the survey results yesterday. And of course, most of my CSIS colleagues also participated in this survey. So the survey, a couple of questions in the survey are related to this question. So the survey first asked about 80 leading U.S. experts on China in the United States. In what region do you expect China to be escalating militarily the most? And the top region that most experts selected was actually South China Sea, 43%. Taiwan was named at 33% in terms of China most willing to use military escalation in 2026. And the third category was Senkakus at 10%. In terms of the most relevant to this question with respect to Taiwan, we did ask in our survey, and these were all U.S. experts on China that have either served in the U.S. government or have extensive publication, are very well-known U.S. experts like Tom, right? Of course, and Henrietta. So what we asked in terms of thinking through looking at Taiwan for the next 3 years, we asked the question is, what do you assess the risk of a U.S.-China military conflict over Taiwan to be between now and 2028 compared to a year ago? And here the survey results are very, very interesting because it actually shows 41% said the risk of a military conflict are higher in the next 3 years. 35% said no change in the next 3 years, and 24% said lower in the next 3 years. So that shows you that as a lot of China experts in the United States are watching dynamics and watching how China may be assessing, I think they're seeing a lot of mixed signals, at least in terms of interpreting what the U.S. government is willing to do vis-a-vis Taiwan. And that gets us to one more survey question that we asked, which is your assessment, which is of leading U.S. experts, what do you assess in terms of how China assesses to be U.S. commitment to Taiwan? And the question we asked, does China believe that the United States is now less committed to supporting and defending Taiwan? And the survey results showed 66% of U.S. experts actually believe that China is that they agree with that statement, that they believe that China believes the United States is less committed to Taiwan. So that's why our survey had these interesting results in terms of whether folks think that China may be more willing to use force in the next 3 years.
Fascinating. Sid.
It's kind of interesting, as a non-China expert, but somebody who watches it from the sidelines and looks at North Korea behavior often benchmarked after Chinese behavior. And one of the shared areas of concern is how serious these potential adversaries see the U.S. commitment to be. And, the stereotypes that marked the early days of President Trump's second term have been somewhat overturned yet, but maybe not fully absorbed. In other words, Donald Trump is not an isolationist who is not interested in events that occur overseas. He's not even solely focused on Central and South America. He's not solely focused on this part of the world. And he's not reluctant to use force in the promotion, defense of U.S. interests as he sees them, obviously. And so, the question that really Pyongyang and Beijing should be asking is Taiwan, is North Korea, defense of Taiwan and defense of South Korea in U.S. national interest? And everything that the president has said, again, with skeptics at the beginning of 2025 worried about his commitment to alliances, I think from somebody who's looked at the alliance for decades, I'm pretty happy with where we are. So I think, maybe that will change over time if that is indeed Beijing's view that the United States would not come to the defense of Taiwan. But from everything else I hear, and it's important that we remember, the Taiwan issue draws so much of our attention, but China is a revisionist power with ambitions, globally, as well as in, South China Sea, East China Sea, in the provisional maritime zone with South Korea, which is becoming problematic. It's behavior that is troublesome and that will kind of drive U.S. foreign policy and national security concerns are far beyond just Taiwan itself. It's an important question, but there's other areas that we need to focus on.
Maria, I think you're going to skip this Taiwan-specific question. I'll move over to Henrietta to close us out on this one.
Great. Well, I agree with the Guild, so I don't know how much I've done. And I think Tom raises a really important perspective on the politics of all of this and how, if we're looking at the question of the likelihood of China attacking Taiwan with significant military force over the next 2.5 years, I mean, you're looking at kind of a continually building risk profile over time. I mean, culminating towards the end of that period with the Taiwan elections in January 2028, with the US presidential cycle, and then with Xi entering his fourth term. And even you can see how the risk kind of evolves over time. For example, thinking about Xi's perspectives of what the PLA can achieve. He is clearly unhappy right now. We see that with the purges of a huge number of Chinese military leaders, but over the course of that 2 and a bit years of time, I mean, Xi will be able to replace every one of those military leaders if he chooses to do so. It's very possible that he will at least perceive the PLA to be more capable, less corrupt, more politically reliable than it was in the past. Just around that period of time, when the politics all come together in a very kind of high-risk way as well. And that can layer in a fashion that I still think is far, far away from the most likely outcome being Beijing's decision to use force against Taiwan. I don't think that's most likely, but the risk will be very high. But in part because of that, it'll be relatively lower in 2026. Just one other thing I would want to highlight, though, is there's two ways in which a conflict over Taiwan could emerge. The first is what we've really been discussing so far. It's China, Xi Jinping wakes up one day and says, this is the day. I have decided I can wait no longer. We are doing reunification. We're doing it now. But there's another way in which a conflict over Taiwan could emerge, and that's an accident. I mean, we've seen Beijing do these increasingly aggressive military exercises around Taiwan with frequency and closer around the island every time. And so we're creating an environment, I don't think this is China's intent. I don't think they want to be necessarily getting closer to actual conflict through these exercises. But that's what they're doing. Because at a certain point, Beijing cannot control the risk profile of its own military exercises when they are taken with such intensity so close to Taiwan. And especially in an environment where I think President Lai will feel like he has to demonstrate his credibility, his ability to defend the island. I mean, China's creating an environment where even if war is the last thing it wants, you could get into a cycle of accidental escalation that is very difficult to de-escalate from, especially when we remember there are no meaningful channels of communication between Beijing and Taipei. And military-to-military communication between Washington and Beijing is pretty weak as well. So the risk, even inadvertently, could be higher than any side wants it to be over the coming year.
Great points. Let's move on to question number 3. I'm really excited for this one. It's a fascinating one. Which of the following relationships will progress most this year? So options are China-Russia, China-North Korea, North Korea-Russia, or the Trilat, China, Russia, North Korea. Not to be confused with Japan-Korea, US Trilat. A little more even split on this one, I think. Interesting pull ahead for North Korea, Russia. Let's give it another couple moments. I think people are pondering this one. All right, let's pause it. All right, so a little more even spread on this one. We've got in the lead with 39%, the North Korea-Russia relationship. That's interesting. That's not what I would have guessed for this group. Otherwise, China-Russia, China-North Korea, and China-Russia-North Korea are all hovering right around that 20% mark. So interesting split here. Bonnie, let's start with you and then go down the line. I'm really curious to hear everyone's thoughts on this question.
Thank you. I think this question, as you mentioned, was particularly tough. And I think for me, it was hard for me to assess whether it would be China-Russia's relationship progressing the most or North Korea-Russia. And I guess I'm going to defer to both Maria and Sid on the North Korea-Russia question. But I thought there was a potential that you could see quite a bit of growth in the North Korea-Russia relationship, in the way that we've seen that growth over time. But I'm pretty confident if you were to add China to the equation, that the China-Russia relationship is likely to grow faster, or at least maintain its current pace in the China-North Korea relationship, or the China-Russia-North Korea relationship, which then involves all 3 countries. And I think just looking at dynamics right around the end of the new year, where we saw President Xi Jinping send his greeting letters to a variety of world leaders. So he sent it to Putin, and Putin sent a letter back, and the 2 sides decided that they talked about how 2025 was a year of success. And I think during Xi's letter, he also noted that 2026 is the 30th anniversary of the China-Russia Strategic Partnership Coordination, the 25th anniversary of the signing of the China-Russia Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation, and that 2026 and 2027 will be designated as the China-Russia Years of Education. And then, of course, Putin, in his letter back, also said, great year in 2025. He's going to seek to continue to have cooperation and communication with Xi in 2026. But some of the interesting statistics we saw in 2025 was China-Russia military exercises have dropped to a low that we haven't seen in prior years, but that could be due to issues within the PLA. I think there's also recent data showing just about, like in the last week or so, that China's trade with Russia also fell. So I think there's still potential for the relationship to strengthen, but I think it's already strengthened quite a bit, so it's reaching some of its limitations. Now, interestingly, when Xi and his wife sent a greeting letter to Kim Jong-un, that was basically not featured very much at all in North Korean media. Kim featured the greeting letter from Putin, but not so much from Xi. So at least in terms of what North Korea is interested in, that we're not seeing too much receptivity from North Korea and publicly displaying or showcasing that relationship.
Yeah, Sid, over to you, and then Maria, about this North Korea-Russia relationship.
Sure. On the Xi letter, it's always fascinating to see how quickly, you can see fluctuations in the DPRK-PRC relationship over time, to the point where, as somebody who follows it over the longer term, I urge people to kind of step back and look at the broad parameters, because within how good DPRK-PRC relations can get, or how bad they can get, there are limits. And so, and the fluctuations in there are more tactical. It could be a slight, it could have been something she said or didn't respond to, you know, when Kim went, visited Beijing last year. It's hard to tell. I think, you know, in the question on Russia and North Korea, it really depends on whether you're using, you know, the verb continue, progress, or evolve, right? And so I think those who would be surprised at the relatively high number of the North Korea-Russia response probably are thinking in their heads, it's already evolved so much, how much more could it progress? You know, if it's true that, Russia had shipped 2 pressurized water reactors for use in a North Korean nuclear submarine, you know, what more could it be that they're going to send warheads next? I think the North Korea-Russia relationship will likely continue, and it depends upon, you know, the war and, you know, whether there's need for more DPRK soldiers to go or not. If what was true in the assessment was that it was Kim Jong-un's idea and not Vladimir Putin's to send the troops in the first place, the question really becomes, what does Kim want next? But, you know, so it's an area that we need to look at. It's an area where North Korea is probably being strengthened and emboldened to see a global order more conducive to his type of revisionist, you know, axis of upheaval behavior. Not feeling that any particular need to sit down with the United States or Republic of Korea in anything but a mere symbolic manner, not pursuing unification. All these trends will continue. And I think finally, in terms of the 17% is worth talking about in terms of China, Russia, North Korea. I think those of us who have thought and talked about this the most continue to agree that within this crank, this China, Russia, Iran, North Korea grouping, that the dyads, the bilaterals, the one-on-ones are what we see more of. Bilateral, yes, sometimes transactional, some more within the strategic context, however, but what we continue not to see is this, you know, trilateral or quadrilateral or whatever type of cooperation. And so the idea that China, Russia, North Korea cooperation will progress next year is probably, in my opinion, less likely that will still hold true. Each actor will see acting bilaterally within the atmosphere that is created by the larger grouping, but not in any way where, you know, it would be complicated, or more sovereignty or autonomy questions would come into play by greater obligations.
Maria.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I find it interesting that the 3 top answers all have Russia in it, which again demonstrate this. Russia is the key driver underlying these alliances and its war in Ukraine, and essentially revisionist ambition to undermine the Western posture internationally kind of creates the opportunities for these countries to ride along. I agree with my colleagues that some of the trends we have seen in the past make it unlikely that we'll see major progress on any of those dimensions. In terms of Russia-China, just as Bonnie has flagged, we have seen that it may have reached, in terms of pure material capabilities, some of the limits. Economically, for example, the investment of China in Russia has stagnated, despite the seemingly very positive rhetoric in that regard, especially on the Russian side. In terms of North Korea, I find it very interesting when it comes to the relationship between these 3 countries. While indeed we have not seen trilateral cooperation, what is interesting is that it's not also seems that they all factions in a strictly bilateral manner. And what I mean by that is that if you look at certain patterns of cooperation, again, as our CRINC reports flag, first of all, diplomatically, you see that, for example, China and Russia tend to coordinate quite significantly, and increasingly Russia is also withdrawing from its previous participation in the North Korea sanctions, which of course is highly concerning dynamic. But also economically / in terms of security assistance that North Korea and China provided to Russia since the start of 2022 invasion of Ukraine, what we see is where China is acting in the open, like trying not to circumvent some of the sanctions that have been imposed, especially, most importantly, providing dual-use equipment and goods. North Korea is more in the open, providing other elements and supplies that Russia may need in terms of munition, arms, and of course also literally manpower and engineers, construction workers. So, and the very interesting pattern that we have found is that both China and North Korea have intensified the supplies to Russia at the same time. In the fall 2022, when Russia realized it was not going to be a so-called special military operation, it was going to be a full-scale war of attrition, and it means you need resources. And you see that in pretty much at the same time, coordination with North Korea. There's an increase of supplies that is being tracked by our colleagues from Korea program through the satellite imagery, and there is similar increase in supplies in dual-use support from China. So whether coordinated or not, it's clear that Russia, in this sense, acts as a key connector between North Korea and China, and I think it's a very interesting pattern to watch. So without necessarily disagreeing with my colleagues that primarily we see the bilateral nature of this cooperation, there's clearly more going on, and I would look at this China, Russia, North Korea triad in more detail.
All right, circling back to Henrietta on the China piece of this.
Great. I expect we will continue to see over the course of 2026 a significant deepening of the China-Russia relationship. There has already been, huge movement on this front since 2022, but just to take a step back and think about the strategic rationale here. From Xi Jinping's perspective, the Russia relationship is as much about domestic stability as foreign policy, and that's part of why it matters so much in China's current world orientation, because this isn't even just about Russia. It's about China having Putin's Russia specifically as a buffer against the Western color revolutions that Putin has convinced Xi will be on his doorstep if Putin is not there to fend them off. And so for that reason, even beyond any kind of more conventional foreign policy considerations, Xi is deeply committed to supporting Russia, supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, making sure that Putin himself does not fail. And then from the Russian perspective, Maria could speak to this much more eloquently, but it seems like, Russia's top priority in the China relationship, you could say the same thing with North Korea, is securing the support it requires to continue fighting the war in Ukraine. And without China's support, Russia absolutely could not fight. Their military has become so fundamentally dependent on these dual-use inputs, on the manufacturing capacity of China in order to regenerate battlefield losses, that it's kind of become an existential question for Putin as well. And so I think over the coming year, we're going to see a continued movement towards integration of the Chinese and the Russian defense industrial bases. And that has huge implications for the broader security environment in Europe and in Asia and the interconnectedness of those two theaters. So you're going to see a Russian military increasingly backed by the full manufacturing capacity of the People's Republic of China. That has huge implications not only for the balance of forces in Ukraine, but for the future of NATO's security as well. And then when you look at the Chinese military capacity, you're going to see Russia increasingly feeling like it has no choice but to share the really high-end military technologies with China that it has tried to keep off the table for years. And that's going to address bottlenecks in PLA modernization that's going to allow the Chinese armed forces to really skyrocket ahead with their own capabilities in the region, and that will have important implications for Asia. So altogether, I think the China-Russia relationship is going to continue to deepen, but it's also going to continue to grow in importance for the overall trends in security in the region, in Asia, in Europe, and around the world. I just want to say one thing about the North Korea piece, though, because I think the China, Russia, North Korea trilat idea is an interesting one. And one that I think is, if the odds of it moving ahead in 2026 are so low, I think that largely accrues to Beijing and their real nervousness about losing relative influence over North Korea to the Russians. Because ultimately, do I think that China is maybe the most responsible actor in how it handles nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula? No. But China has I think, authentic desire to manage the Korean Peninsula responsibly, to avoid, nuclear implications that could affect their own borderlands. Russia just wants North Korean ammunition. I mean, Russia's only worried about what it's getting from North Korea today to sustain the war in Ukraine today. Russia doesn't care about stability, instability in Northeast Asia, whatever. And that, I think, it's not something China's ever going to say. We're never going to see them, above the watermark express concern about Russia and North Korea, their relationship. But I think Beijing is quite anxious, ultimately, about what it means if China's kind of traditional role in North Korea is increasingly eroded by Russian power. So I'll stop there.
Great point. Tom.
Thanks a lot. All day I've been looking at the audience votes, and I've been really impressed with the audience. It's not surprising, I guess, a bunch of people who hang around CSIS are savvy and understand international politics. But there's one time I just have to disagree with the audience in a more fundamental way. And I think it might be my reading of the question, and Sid touched upon this, which is I'm looking for deltas. I'm looking for change. Positive change in a relationship. And I agree with everything that Henrietta just said about China-Russia, but this is already happening. There's a pretty deep relationship, and it's deepening at a certain rate. And I expect it to continue to deepen for the reasons she laid out so well. North Korea-Russia is, asymptotic to being in an alliance. It's not quite a full alliance, but it's pretty close when they're fighting together in distant lands. So I don't expect a big delta there. I expect it to continue to be close. So I think the big delta, and I would give it a much higher score than everything else, is China-North Korea. And the reason being the one that Henrietta just laid out, it's not just Russians who think in terms of spheres of influence. And it's not just Americans increasingly who think in terms of spheres of influence. China thinks in terms of spheres of influence. And North Korea is in China's sphere of influence. And I don't think that Chinese strategic analysts are entirely happy about this very close relationship between North Korea and Russia. And when China gets jealous of North Korea's relations with the outside world, China's tendency is to improve relations with North Korea. We saw this in the Trump 1.0 administration when symmetry started. There was very deep symmetry between China and North Korea at the same time, and I don't think that was a coincidence. And that is, we're going to preserve our relationship. We're going to make sure we know exactly what you're doing with others. So I expect China to try to improve its relations with North Korea, which have been relatively distant. And if there's more noise in the coming year about a new summit between President Trump and Secretary Kim, then I would expect that to go further above and beyond the concerns about Russia and North Korea. And unfortunately, from a U.S. perspective, when China wants to have more influence over North Korea, In general, what it tries to do is tighten its relationship with North Korea, under the argument that this gives us leverage. We can't afford to alienate them. We don't want to pressure them too much because when we have less say over what they do, and yeah, they kind of wink, they won't say it. We see them as kind of loose cannons, but we want to keep them under control, and the best way to control them is to engage them. So that is another reason for them to want to stabilize their immediate region by improving relations with North Korea. And then finally, China wants to drive a wedge between the United States, Japan, ROK, triangular relations, which they see as unnatural. If you can't keep Japan and South Korea apart, you're failing, right? It's just, so these are cats and dogs, right? Right? You ought to be able to do this, and they're not able to do it. And one of the reasons they're not able to do it is their own behavior, and they tend not to be very self-reflective about that. But another reason they find it hard to do is North Korea. North Korea brings South Korea and Japan together. So again, it's another incentive for China to try to get closer to North Korea, to try to keep North Korea from taking obnoxious actions that will drive the Koreans and the Japanese together at a time when I think the Chinese probably see an opportunity because of Prime Minister Takaichi's historical view of history, or traditional view of history from a conservative perspective, and the ability to drive wedges. North Korea could spoil all that, so why not get closer to this? So I really think, I would say 80% China and North Korea should be there, and the other ones only because relations are so good, already, I don't see the delta.
Can I make a quick, this is just an observation. Has Beijing publicly stated it recognizes a nuclear North Korea? Question one. Has Beijing publicly supported Russia's aggression in Ukraine? I think in both of those answers, the answer is no. And so to me, it seems like Beijing still sees some reputational risk and a desire not to be seen as aligning against the liberal world order all in. And so that's perhaps an area that we can use going forward to hopefully.
Right. So on that one score, Sid, on China and North Korea, the one thing that has changed is China has stopped talking about denuclearization.
That's true.
And that's important, because they used to always say we're against the nuclear peninsula, and they didn't always put pressure on North Korea. I was in the six-party talks, you were in the six-party talks, so you know that process. But they've stopped portraying themselves as a country that really cares deeply about this issue.
Foreign Minister Lavrov said Russia understands and respects North Korea's nuclear weapons program, given its security interests. That's short of we recognize in North Korea, but it's beyond simply stopping talking about denuclearization, like you mentioned, Beijing has.
So I'm looking at deltas. I'm not looking at an alliance, a really tight alliance, but I think they've been pretty distant in the recent past, and they're going to get closer, I think.
Yeah.
Well, this is always more fun when there's some disagreement, so especially with the audience. So, let's move on to our fourth question. In 2026, U.S. efforts to bolster deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region will accelerate to counter coercion from North Korea, China, and Russia, sustain current momentum in coordination with allies and partners, or decelerate due to competing security challenges in other regions. So again, this is U.S. efforts, how we're going to view U.S. efforts in the Indo-Pacific region. And we're closing in on our time, so I'm just going to give another couple seconds here. Everyone press their buttons, get it in. All right, let's pause. Got some good numbers in here already. So, again, pretty clear, slight majority, 55% to decelerate. I think the U.S. efforts will decelerate to bolster deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. About 27% think it'll be sustained, and 18% think it will accelerate. So a little bit of a spread there, but definitely a clear winner. Given our time, I'm going to add in one last question as well. So for all the panelists to answer both their thoughts on this, but also in probably 1 to 2 minutes or less total, what the recent Venezuela actions by the U.S. mean for China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So, Krink, kind of dovetails nicely on this question, I think, as well. So let's start with Sid, and then we'll go to Maria. I think you just maybe address that Venezuela question and then wrap around.
If there was an option to have a write-in vote, I would have said disappoint. And disappoint's kind of a hybrid of B and C. We're well past the decade anniversary of the first use of the term Asia pivot, and we've been trying to pivot to Asia over and over and over again. And the most recent iteration of that is, of course, those calls for making all of our DoD efforts focus on China, strengthen capabilities in the region, work with the ROK, Republic of Korea, to partner on China. But world events, and particularly if we get involved in Iran, world events will continue to delay the type of more robust pivot or bolstering of deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region, I think that many people who watch this region wish we would otherwise do. And part of that is because, as I mentioned earlier, I think North Korea and China are relatively sophisticated in the way they are able to enhance their capabilities in a way that demonstrates a growing threat, but doesn't drive us to move more aggressively to respond to the growing threat. Maybe that's just the way that we are. We have to just deal with the threats that we have today. That said, I think the multilateral efforts we talked earlier about, for example, ROC, Japan, U.S. cooperation, that will continue. President Trump's commitments to the alliances is encouraging. There's not going to be, I think, a deceleration or a deterioration, but there will be a slowing. And so in that regard, it's just something that, we will have to work with and ensure that it's not taken advantage of by China or North Korea. The Venezuela question, I think about, if I focus on North Korea in particular, the operation itself to rendition the president of Venezuela demonstrates capabilities that have to be of concern to North Korea. In particular, if they're looking at a force in which, without Kim Jong-un, there's no dead hand. Nobody's in charge of nuclear weapons. And so, what's appealing about talking about decapitation on the peninsula is it's often talked about as the quickest way towards termination of a conflict. Not that we're looking to assassinate Kim next week, but the capabilities demonstrated there, the capabilities demonstrated in the bombing of Iran, both of those, I think. On the downside, they reinforce North Korea's perception the U.S. is unreliable and can't be trusted. But I think from a deterrence perspective, they're helpful in strengthening our ability to try to deter North Korea from more aggressive action.
Maria.
Yeah. Thank you. I will just quickly comment on the question on the screen, in that it seems that much of the U.S. strategy vis-a-vis Russia is premised on the assumption that by pulling Russia, by being friendly, more moderated towards Russia and pulling it away from China, there will be an opportunity to do this reverse Nixon. And as much as of criticism this strategy has received in the analytical community, because for the reasons that we flagged already, that it's impossible, next to impossible right now to pull Putin away from China, because that's how he achieves his revisionist goals internationally. Nonetheless, it seems that many of the U.S. policymakers remain committed to this posture, and that almost by default, right, undermines the idea of deterrence in the region, because the China and Russia alliances we have flagged right now has strengthened very significantly, and this strategy is unlikely to pull Russia away from China at this point. And I think it's just a reality that, unfortunately, will have to be accepted. To that, however, the question, the degree of strength of this alliance is constantly strengthened by fortunes of the autocratic regimes across the globe. Because going back, now switching to Venezuela, we have seen with Venezuela or Iran, in Russian case also with Syria, that every time Putin's allies are suffering, they're asking for help. Russia's response over the last 4 years has been repeatedly muted expression of concerns, not much action. And that, of course, is a signal of weakness, and I think it's also true to some extent of the way China responded to Venezuela as well. So yes, we see this deepening alliance. It's clearly ideologically driven beyond just tactical considerations, but when it comes to actual action, and Venezuela example demonstrates that it leaves much to be desired, thankfully. From Russian perspective, Venezuela certainly is a very blunt demonstration of how special military operations are supposed to be done, as opposed to, being dragged in Ukraine for 4 years with no end in sight. This is an efficient, technically very well-conducted operation. Definitely also a certain blow to its status of protector. Venezuela was de facto client state, and Russia could not come to its defense. There's some talk about the Russian hardware, the air defense systems that failed to work in trying to shoot down U.S. aircraft, so it's also does not look great when it comes to Russian arms. Most importantly, however, I would flag that Venezuela, first of all, I think the story is far from over. We don't really know what sort of regime is going to emerge to replace the current one, and accordingly, it's hard to speculate as to what's going to happen and how big of a blow it is indeed to Putin. Because if this current regime survives, it may be not so bad. But the key issue that I think may be troubling for Russia is the energy dimension. While the oil dynamic in Venezuela is unlikely to radically affect oil prices, given the markets at the moment, what is particularly concerning is the deepening attack on the shadow fleet that the U.S. is currently trying to implement, because as we know, Russia has built all of this network of sanctions circumvention that is extremely reliant on the shadow fleet. If, thanks to these actions by the U.S. government, there is a pathway to understand how to crack down on those boats, this will be potentially a major blow to Russia going forward, and I'm sure the Kremlin is looking at it with a lot of interest.
Well, unfortunately, we are just at time, so I am being told we need to wrap this up. We're not going to get time to get to our last couple of speakers for that question. But thank you all so much. Could I please have everyone join me in a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you all. And thanks so much for joining today.